Every criminal empire in Star Wars has a starting point, a place where the whole thing began. And for the Hutts, that place was a green paradise world orbiting two suns that their entire species worshipped as gods. And the story of what happened to that world explains pretty much everything about who the Hutts turned out to be. Drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to follow along as we build out this entire lore community together. Now let's get into it. The story starts on a planet called Varl. It sat in a system called Ardos, in the stretch of space that would eventually be known as Hutt space, along a hyperlane called the Pabul Hutta. According to Hutt tradition, Varl was a lush green paradise world orbiting two suns, Evona and Ardos, and the Hutts worshipped both of those suns as gods. They believed those suns were divine beings, lovers in the sky, and that the Hutt species itself had descended directly from them. That belief that they were the children of gods became the foundation of everything the Hutts would ever do. It gave them the sense that they were above other species, that they were meant to rule. They even called themselves near gods, and that arrogance, it never left them. Now Varl was also shared with a related species called the Tallanda Till, the Hutts' gentler cousin species, and possibly the Rybets as well. All three appear to share a common evolutionary ancestry rooted in that same world. But the Tallanda Till and the Rybets are footnotes. The Hutts are the story. Here is what the Hutts actually looked like in the beginning. They evolved as enormous slug-like beings, hermaphroditic meaning they had no fixed gender. They had thick, leathery skin, watery eyes, 3 lungs, small arms, a wide mouth, and a muscular tail they used to drag themselves through the mud and the muck. When a Hutt was born, it came into the world as a tiny Huttlet under half a meter tall after spending 50 years developing inside a parent's brood pouch, which is an extraordinary amount of time for a gestation period by any measure. And once they finally arrived, they could live over 1,000 standard years, making them one of the longest living sentient species in the entire galaxy. Their bodies were also built like natural armor. The thick layer of blubber, mucus, and oily sweat covering them acted as a shield against the environment. They could hold their breath for extended periods, a trait that went back to their evolutionary roots in the ancient seas and swamps of Varl. And their jaws could open to extraordinary widths, wide enough to swallow almost anything whole. That detail would matter a great deal to anyone who ever crossed Jabba the Hutt at his Tatooine court. There was one other thing about Hutt biology that shaped their entire future more than almost anything else. They were naturally resistant to Force mind tricks. A Jedi could not wave a hand at a Hutt and reshape their thinking. The resistance was baked into them at the biological level. Any diplomat, any negotiator, any Jedi who ever sat across from a Hutt and tried to use the Force to nudge things in their direction found out very quickly that it did not work. The Hutts could not be persuaded that way. They had to be dealt with on their own terms. Before the Hutts ever built an empire or a crime cartel, before Kossak or Jabba or any of the famous names, they spent a long stretch of their history living under someone else's boot. The species responsible for that was the Rakata, who built the galaxy's first true superpower and used hyperdrives powered by the dark side of the Force to conquer hundreds of worlds around 35,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Varl was one of those worlds. During that period, the Hutts were a subjugated species. They worked for Rakatan overlords, their resources were harvested, and their freedom was gone. But around 25,200 years before Yavin, the Rakatan Empire fell apart from the inside. Civil war tore through it, and a galaxy-wide plague finished the job. When the Rakata collapsed, the Hutts seized everything left behind on Varl, including Rakatan hyperdrives, weapons technology, and engineering principles. They inherited the infrastructure of the galaxy's greatest empire and used it to launch themselves into space. Now here is where the early Hutts get interesting, because the species that would one day become famous for sitting on thrones and running crime syndicates started out as something completely different. The early Hutts were an aggressive expansionist warrior species. They invaded neighboring worlds and gave those worlds two choices: submit and become thralls, or face total destruction. Hundreds of worlds learned what it meant to fall into Hutt hands during this era. Their military units included armored warriors mounted in iron shells with mechanical limbs, treads, and wheels, the ancient ancestors of what would later be known as the Shell Hutts. Sakyan records also describe the Hutts paying for the construction of weapons called planechanga, massive tubular rail guns that accelerated asteroids to planet-destroying speeds. These were conquerors, not criminals. The shadow economy crime lords came much later. Then there is the myth, the story the Hutts told themselves about why Varl ended up the way it did. According to that legend, their god star Evona was lured into a black hole and swallowed by darkness. Ardos, the other sun, responded with grief and fury, erupting and expelling its outer shell, destroying every planet in the system except for Varl. The Hutts survived. Their world was devastated. The atmosphere was torn away. The biosphere was wrecked. What remained was a cratered wasteland swept by acid rain. But the Hutts were still there, and in their mythology, surviving that catastrophe was proof that they were chosen, that they were superior, that the death of their gods had singled them out as the worthy ones. Scholars outside of Hutt culture largely pushed back on this story. The most accepted alternative theory among outside historians was that the Hutts destroyed Varl themselves during an ancient civil war, perhaps turning their own planechanga railguns on their own system. The evidence that Varl had once been a green, thriving world was real. And the fact that only asteroids, the apparent remains of 3 former moons, orbited the white dwarf Ardos gave the catastrophe story some physical weight, even if the cause was disputed. Researchers from the Baobab archives reportedly found Hutt artifacts on those very moons, supporting the idea that the system had once been far more inhabited than anyone could tell by looking at what was left. Whatever actually happened, the result was the same. Varl was finished, and the Hutts who survived carried forward a story that made them feel destined to rule. They saw themselves as children of dead gods, survivors of a cosmic catastrophe, and inheritors of a conquered empire's technology all at once. The arrogance built into the Hutt species over those first thousands of years was the product of everything that happened on and around that dead green world, and it would drive every decision they made for the next 25,000 years. They were about to build something, and the galaxy was not ready for it. The Rakatan Infinite Empire fell around 25,200 years before the Battle of Yavin. And the moment it did, the Hutts moved. Quickly, with purpose. And what they built in the aftermath was something the galaxy had never seen from them before. With Varl free of Rakatan control for the first time and inherited alien technology sitting right in front of them, the Hutts made a transition that most species never manage. They went from being a regional power on the edge of the Outer Rim to running a full galactic empire. Varl became the capital of that empire, and it would hold that position for roughly 10,000 years until the catastrophe that eventually tore the Hutt homeworld apart. For context on how significant that window of time is, the Hutt Empire was already operational about 1,200 years before the Galactic Republic even existed. Later historians looking back on this era made a point that is easy to overlook. In the gap between the fall of the Rakata and the rise of the Republic, the Hutt Empire was arguably the only major power in the entire galaxy. There was no one else. So what did the Hutts do with that kind of unchallenged position? They expanded. Clan by clan, they pushed outward and claimed throne worlds across the region that would become known as Hutt space. The approach was simple and consistent. Species that the Hutts deemed useful were made prisoner and put to work. Species that resisted or were judged to have no value faced something much worse. Worlds like Delacreeks and Rin got caught in the crossfire between competing Hutt clans and were devastated in the process, used as examples of what happened when a world fell on the wrong side of a Hutt dispute. There was one species that managed to earn a different outcome: the Sakians. They were a militarily capable people, and the Hutts respected that enough to let them keep their independence. The arrangement worked on the Hutts' terms naturally. The Sakians kept their freedom but paid regular tribute. That was the deal. And it was the kind of deal that tells you a lot about how the Hutts thought, because it was more economically efficient than fighting and subjugating them outright. The Hutts understood very early that the most powerful position in any relationship is the one that makes you the most money. That economic thinking ran through everything they built during this era. The Hutts established a network of trade routes to bind the empire together, including the Pabal Hutta, running from Varl to Bunta, the Pabal Slaheiron, and the Pabal Krita. These routes became the backbone of Hutt commerce and gave them leverage over every species that needed to move goods through their territory. Many of their neighbors chose to pay tribute or accept Hutt trade dominance rather than risk an invasion. The empire was not just held together by force. It was held together by the threat of force combined with the genuine economic benefits of staying on good terms with the species running the routes everyone needed. This kind of economic pragmatism, power enforced through control of money and movement, was the early seed of what would eventually grow into the Khajiitic philosophy that defined Hutts for the rest of their history. Now, while all of this was happening at the empire level, the internal structure of Hutt society was something else entirely. The Hutts never had a single king or a central monarch running everything. Their society was organized around clans, always had been, and the empire itself was closer to a loose confederation of warlord territories than a unified government with one authority at the top. Each clan ran its own territory, its own operations, and its own agenda. Rivalries between clans were settled through raids and sabotage. The clans with the deepest roots went all the way back to the forgotten early history of Varl. Desilijik and Besadai both traced their lineage to that era, long before the rise of Khajiitic philosophy and long before the Galactic Republic was anything more than an idea. Desilijik in particular had a reputation in Hutt mythology as a warrior clan that won its battles through spying, manipulation, and sabotage as much as through direct fighting. That combination of strength and cunning would define the clan for the next 25,000 years. One early Desilijik figure worth knowing is Rasmal Desilijik Bansek. Rasmal took on 8 rival Hutt clans and defeated every one of them to secure the territory that became Kor Desilijik, the clan's throne world, in a region called the Butana Hutta. The palace built there, named after Rasmal himself, housed the oldest surviving artifacts and records of the Desiligic clan for thousands of years after. That kind of legacy, defeating multiple rivals to carve out a permanent claim, was exactly what it took to build a lasting name in early Hutt society. As for the Rakatan technology that had made all of this possible, the Hutts adapted it over time. They stripped out the dark side components that had powered the original Rakatan systems and kept the functional hardware, building on what they had inherited. Whether the Hutts had actually developed interstellar capability on their own or had taken what the Rakata left behind was a question that historians later found impossible to answer, largely because the Hutts' own historical records were contradictory and self-serving. Much of early Hutt history had, as scholars put it, decayed into mythology. The Hutts themselves were happy to claim full credit wherever they could, because it reinforced the story they had been telling about themselves since the days of Varl. 70 years into this post-Rakatan dominance, around 25,130 years before the Battle of Yavin, a warlord appeared along the northern edge of Hutt territory that the Hutts were not prepared to absorb or pay off. His name was Jim, and he had inherited the Cronies sweeps and the kingdom of Kron from his father, a pirate lord. Zim was aggressive, ambitious, and extremely well-equipped. His armies carried beam tube weapons, the ancestors of blasters. His soldiers wore ceramic armor made of a material called kyrium. His forces used war robots of a complexity that made them genuinely difficult to stop. And his grip on conquered territory was enforced by a secret police organization called the Genoharadan, who used mass executions at places like the Forbidden Gardens of Nuswata to make sure no one in his empire forgot what disobedience cost. The Tion cluster, the region Jim was carving through, sat right on the edge of Hutt space, and the Hutts and the Tionese had already been fighting over control of a triangle of worlds called the Cyclata cluster that sat between them. With Zim pushing outward and the Hutts pushing back, a full collision was only a matter of time. The most dangerous external threat the Hutt Empire had ever faced was now sitting on their doorstep, and it had a name. The Hutts had never faced anything quite like Zim the Despot, and for a brief and genuinely frightening stretch of history, it showed. By 25,130 years before the Battle of Yavin, Zim controlled a sprawling empire that stretched from a region called the Radama Void all the way to the Maw Black Hole Cluster, spanning thousands of worlds. His army carried beam tube weapons, the direct ancestors of the blasters that would one day become standard across the galaxy. His soldiers were protected by ceramic armor made from a rare material called kyrium. His forces included war robots of real sophistication, and his grip on conquered territory was maintained through his secret police, the Genoharadan, who used mass executions at a place called the Forbidden Gardens of Nuswata to enforce loyalty and discourage any thought of resistance. What made Zim especially dangerous to the Hutts was that his expansion was pointed directly at them. The Tion cluster, the region Zim was sweeping through, shared a border with Hutt space, and right between them sat the Cyclata cluster, a triangle of worlds that included Kintan, home of the Nikto species, Clatuine, home of the Clatuinians, and Vodran, home of the Vodrans. Both sides wanted those worlds, and both sides had been pushing at each other over them for years. Zim also had a forward military outpost, an orbital fortress that would later be known as Terman Station, positioned near a world called Sri-Lur in the outer reaches. He was not posturing, he was preparing. Then, in 25,102 years before the Battle of Yavin, Jim stopped preparing and started moving. He launched a lightning assault on a Hutt colony world called Varl, sitting on the fringes of a region known as the Kyrium Reaches, and he devastated it. The attack was fast, it was decisive, and it left the Hutt clans stunned. Varl was taken apart before the Hutts could mount any kind of meaningful defense. And that moment, that single strike, became the event that historians later called the spark that ignited the Zim Wars. The defining external conflict of the entire ancient Hutt Empire had just begun. The problem for the Hutts was that their clan structure, the same system that had made them wealthy and powerful across centuries of expansion, was now working against them. No single authority existed to coordinate a response. Every clan had its own priorities and its own grudges. Getting fractious warlords to agree on anything was difficult enough in peacetime. In a crisis, it could be impossible. One Hutt changed that. His name was Kossak Inajik Ardurv, and he stepped into the chaos left by Varl's fall and did something the Hutt species had almost never seen. He proclaimed himself commander of the Hutt clans. Unilaterally, he called for a unified war effort, got enough of the major clans behind him to make it real, and declared open war on Zim. The tactics he chose were pointed. Rather than meeting Jim purely with fleet power, Kossak turned Jim's own methods against him, organizing campaigns of subterfuge, sabotage, and betrayal that made the Genoharadan look like amateurs on their best day. The Hutts later called Kossak the Devourer of Despots, a title that tells you everything about how they remembered him. He was considered the greatest Hutt in all of history, and that reputation held across the full span of Hutt civilization. Zorba the Hutt, who was Jabba's own father, still swore by Kossak's name during the era of the Galactic Civil War, roughly 25,000 years after Kossak actually lived. That is the kind of reverence we are talking about. A second major figure emerged alongside Kossak during this period. Bunta Hestilik Shadru, known as Bunta the Hutt, became the war's other essential leader. While Kossak managed the broader clan coalition, Bunta was on the ground and in the fight, and his contributions shaped the war just as much. Around 25,101 years before Yavin, Kossak led the Hutt fleet to a region called Vontor, which had long been used for Hutt ritual combats and also happened to be a source of Kyrium, the same valuable material Jim's soldiers wore into battle. The first battle of Vontor went to the Hutts. Jim's pilots were outmaneuvered, the Tionese took a serious defeat, and Jim was formally pushed back from worlds the Hutts had claimed. By any reasonable measure, that should have prompted him to reassess his position. It did not. Zim was so confident of eventual victory that he renamed the Hutt world of Slahairon the Ninth Throne and drew up detailed plans for how he intended to divide Hutt territories into provinces after he won. He launched raids against Kintan, Klatuin, and Vodran. He considered the Hutts' claimed worlds meaningless unless physically held. When his own officers urged him to consolidate what he had and stop pushing outward, he had many of them sent to the Forbidden Gardens for execution. He was not a leader who tolerated being told he was wrong. He did eventually concede one system, Moralen, back to the Hutts, but that concession led to something that underlines exactly what kind of war this was. Bunta the Hutt, upon receiving Moralen, wiped out the planet's entire population as a warning to every prisoner species in Hutt service about what happened to worlds that fell on the wrong side. The message was calculated and deliberate. Serve the Hutts and you are protected. End up on a world the Hutts take from Zim and you can be erased at any moment. It was a statement of power made through the most extreme means available. Vontor followed that up by leading the defense of Kovari when Jim counterattacked, sacrificing waves of imprisoned fighters in assaults against Tionese ships and ground forces to hold the line at enormous cost. Jim's simultaneous push towards Slaheron also failed. His ships were driven back toward a region called Zo's Eye, the area that would later be known as Kessel, where many of them were swallowed by the Maw cluster of black holes. Two major setbacks in short succession forced the Hutts to update their understanding of Jim. He was not someone who could be slapped back and expected to fold. He controlled too many worlds, his forces recovered too fast, and his ego made him willing to keep coming regardless of the cost. Kossak brought the fight back to Vontor roughly a year after the first battle. The second battle of Vontor ended without a clear winner. The Hutts absorbed massive losses, but held. Jim failed to deliver the decisive blow he needed. The stalemate was a strategic problem for Jim in a way it was not for the Hutts, because Jim's empire depended on momentum and forward pressure. Kossak recognized that and moved to make Jim's life even more difficult. He gave Vontor command of privateer fleets and set them loose on Jim's supply chains. These raiders hit Tionese shipping routes continuously, draining Jim's material resources and forcing him into paranoid logistics. Jim began routing secret shipments to fortified bases, and he loaded enormous concentrations of treasure onto single ships for protection, including a vessel called the Queen of Ranrun. At the same time, Kossak opened up a second front that had nothing to do with ships or soldiers. He began publicly mocking Jim, challenging the despot's reputation for personal bravery and goading him to prove himself through direct ritual combat. Kossak understood something important about who Jim was. The man's confidence had become a vulnerability. His ego had outgrown his judgment, and if the right pressure was applied in the right way, that ego could be used against him. The trap was being built. Jim just had no idea he was already walking into it. While Kossak was busy goading Jim into a third battle at Vontor, something else was happening entirely out of Jim's sight. Something that would determine the outcome before the first ship ever arrived. Hutt diplomats, reportedly led by a Hutt named Dojundo, were quietly moving through the Cyclata cluster and sitting down with the leaders of three warrior species. The Clatuinians, led by a figure named Barada Mbeg. The Nikto, led by Duemuk. The Vodrans, led by Kliutu Mutela. The Weekwe, another warrior species already aligned with the Hutts, were also brought in as additional military support. What those diplomats were offering was a chance to fight against Jim, who had been raiding Cyclata worlds throughout the war. What they were actually doing was something far more permanent. The agreement they signed was called the Treaty of Vontor, and it bound all three species into eternal service to the Hutts. Baradam Beg, for his part, believed he was signing his people into a sacred struggle. The Clatuinians viewed the war against Jim as something close to a holy cause, and the Hutts were careful to frame it that way. In exchange for service, the Hutts made one concrete promise to the Clatuinians specifically. They would protect a sacred site on Klatooine called the Fountain of Ancients, a location of deep spiritual importance to the Klatooinian people. That promise would be honored for over 25,000 years. But the servitude signed that day had no end date. Baradam Beg had agreed to something with no exit, and the species he led would not fully understand what that meant until long after the war was over. Zim knew none of this. He accepted Kossak's challenge for a third ritual combat 5 years after the first battle, around 25,100 years before the Battle of Yavin. Kossak's terms were simple. If Zim won, he would receive Kovari and what remained of Moralan. If Zim lost, he would give up his claim to the Kyrium reaches entirely. Zim agreed, and then did something that revealed exactly how completely his confidence had overtaken his judgment. He spent everything. He rebuilt his fleets and armies to their absolute maximum, equipping his forces with a new generation of Kyrium-clad war robots that his engineers believed were invincible against laser-based weapons. He brought orbital fortresses to Vontor so that his own court could watch him win in person. His most elite fighters descended from those platforms in massive landing barges, ready to deliver a final and total defeat to the Hutt clans. What Zim found on the surface of Vontor was not the Hutt defensive line he expected. It was millions of Klatooinian, Nikto, Vodran, and Weequay warriors. The Siklaata species he had been raiding throughout the war were now standing between him and everything he had come to claim. According to a memorial later composed by a Klatooinian historian named Pupaku, the battle that followed was the largest armed engagement in galactic history at that point, drawing in nearly a quarter of the species and war machines present in the galaxy across multiple waves of reinforcements. The fighting lasted more than 900 Vontorian spins, which works out to roughly 2.5 standard years of continuous combat. 2.5 years on one battlefield. The Siklaata warriors had prepared themselves in the Klatooinian tradition, using spice to enter a state of intensified aggression before combat, and they held together under pressure that would have shattered most forces. Zim's war robots were designed to be unstoppable in open-field engagements. The Siklaata fighters dragged them underground instead, luring the machines into Vontor's tunnel systems where their advantages disappeared and where the warriors could take them apart piece by piece, even at enormous cost to themselves. Above the planet, Hutt fleets and the combined Siklaata forces hammered Zim's orbital fortresses simultaneously from 2 directions. The moment that turned the battle for good, according to Pupaku, had nothing to do with tactics. It was the moment Zim's own lieutenants looked at the situation and concluded their supposedly unbeatable leader was going to lose. And if he was going to lose, his empire was available. A mutiny broke out inside Zim's own command structure at the worst possible moment, and whatever coordination remained in the Tionese war effort collapsed with it. What happened to Zim after that depends entirely on who you ask. Hutt historical accounts say he was captured, taken in chains to Kossak's dungeons on Varl, and spent the remainder of his life there, blinded and imprisoned. Tionese historians have always maintained that he was taken out on Vontor itself, a victim of treachery. Both versions agree on the ending. He was finished. His empire, the one that had stretched from the Radama Void to the Maw and had terrorized thousands of worlds, was done. One of his treasure ships, the Queen of Ranroon, managed to escape to a planet called Delalt, where it was hidden and guarded for thousands of years afterward by a cache of surviving war robots called the Guardian Corps and a secretive group who called themselves the Survivors. But the Empire itself was gone. What came next was the formal reckoning for the species who had fought under the Hutt banner. The Treaty of Vontor was officially signed after the battle, and what it established was permanent. The Clatuinians, the Nikto, and the Vodrans were now Hutt subjects, bound to serve the Hutt clans for as long as the Hutts existed. The Vodrans went furthest in accepting that reality, eventually reorganizing their own society into Hutt-style clan structures that were entirely subordinate to Hutt Khajidics. The Clatuinians absorbed the loss into their culture in a different way. They named their children after Baradam Beg in generations that followed, honoring the leader who had led them into service. They came to regard the Hutts as near gods, possibly even the beings referred to as the Ancients in their own mythology. The Fountain of Ancients on Clatuine was renamed the Fountain of Hutt Ancients. The people who signed that treaty ended up shaping their entire identity around it. Kovari, the world whose fall had started the whole war, was renamed Bunta in honor of the Hutt who had defended it. The planet never fully returned to its former status and faded into a backwater during the later Republic era. But the name carried. Thousands of years later, the Bunta Eve Classic pod race was held on that world, the same race Anakin Skywalker competed in as a child in The Phantom Menace, with Jabba himself presiding from the grandstands. The name Bunta, given to honor a Hutt war hero from 25,000 years prior, had become attached to one of the most famous sporting events in the Outer Rim. Kossak founded a military academy after the war that operated for thousands of years, with Hutt clans across the galaxy sending their best fighters, mercenaries, and bounty hunters to train at the Inajik clan's institution. The Third Battle of Vontor was treated as a cultural touchstone for the rest of Hutt history. In 0 ABY, a Hutt named Gutu still owned a tapestry depicting the battle. During the Clone Wars, exhibits at a venue called the Cradle of the Galaxy displayed holographic recreations of it for visitors. The Hutts did not let people forget what happened at Vontor. They made sure it stayed visible, because what it represented was the moment they had removed the only power in the Outer Rim capable of challenging them, and they intended to keep it that way. Winning a war is one thing. What the Hutts did after winning theirs is where the real horror of this story begins. Zim's empire did not survive his capture or his end at Vontor, whichever version of that story you accept. It came apart almost immediately. The Kingdom of Kron, which had been absorbed into his holdings, reclaimed its independence. New successor states formed out of the wreckage, including a region called the Jaminere Marches and a political entity known as the Honorable Union of Desevro and Tion. The Tion cluster, which had just been the seat of a galactic empire a few years earlier, fractured into a patchwork of rival territories, all fighting over what was left. Zim's secret police, the Geno Haradan, survived the collapse and went underground, which turned out to be a much bigger long-term problem than anyone realized at the time. That organization would keep operating in the shadows for roughly 20,000 years, eventually evolving into one of the galaxy's most enduring criminal networks, still active during the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War thousands of generations later. One thing worth noting about Zim himself is what happened to his reputation. Even after everything he had done, even after losing, the Tionese held on to him as a hero. He became a figure of nostalgia and myth in the Tion cluster for the next several thousand years, with later Hutt revisionism doing its best to wipe his real accomplishments out of galactic memory. But within the Tionese worlds themselves, the memory of Zim never really faded, which mattered a great deal because the Hutts were not finished with the Tionese. not even close. Invoking the terms of their victory at the Third Battle of Vontor, the Hutts began a systematic campaign of erasure inside the old borders of the Kyrium Reaches. Tionese settlements were destroyed. Worlds were bombarded and poisoned until they could no longer support life. Populations were wiped out to the last person, and in some cases even the historical records of those populations, their names and their cultural memory, were deliberately erased from galactic archives. The Hutts wanted these worlds not just gone, but forgotten. Zim's infrastructure suffered the same treatment. The network of hyperspace beacons he had carefully built to knit his empire together was dismantled, destroyed, or towed away for Hutt use. For thousands of years afterward, explorers trying to move through the old Tion cluster had to chart new routes through regions that had been emptied out because the navigational aids that once guided ships through there were gone. The one exception was an ancient hyperlane called the Warrior's Trace, where the Hutts left the old beacons intact and spared a handful of Tionese worlds. That was not an act of mercy. The Warrior's Trace was being preserved as a future invasion corridor in case the Hutts ever needed to push back into Tionese territory for another campaign. In the middle of all of this, there was a strange religious panic happening inside what remained of Tion. A death cult called the Hierophants of Zo, a priestly order that had served under Jim, fled their home at Nuswata as the Devouring began. They carried with them a prophecy about a final confrontation between humanity and the Hutts that would one day bring about the end of time and something they called the perfection of Zo. Where they went after they left Nuswata is unknown. The Tionese never heard from them again. Their hidden stronghold, if it ever existed, has never been found in any historical record. The Hierophants of Zo disappeared into their own prediction and took their prophecy with them. The Tion cluster, once a rival galactic power with thousands of worlds under Jim's banner, was left as a broken region of traumatized survivors, militarily shattered, economically ruined, psychologically marked in a way that would define the cluster's character for the next several thousand years. The Hutts had achieved exactly what they wanted. The Tion cluster would never pose a military threat to them again for the rest of Hutt history. The species that had once contained Jim the Despot was reduced to scattered survivor worlds that could barely hold themselves together, let alone challenge anyone. Then, around 24,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, roughly 1,100 years after the fall of Jim, something entered the picture that the Hutts had never dealt with before. The Galactic Republic. A new hyperspace route called the Pelemian Trade Route had been discovered, connecting the core worlds all the way out to the Outer Rim, passing through the Tion region on the way. And that route brought Republic explorers, diplomats, and traders into direct contact with both the Tionese survivors and the Hutt Empire for the first time. At this point, the Hutts were still the dominant power in the Outer Rim, though their influence was by now primarily economic. They controlled the trade. They controlled the routes. They controlled the species that moved the goods. The Republic's arrival introduced a new political reality that the Hutts would spend the next 24,000 years navigating, manipulating, and profiting from in every way they could find. They would never again be the only interstellar superpower in the galaxy, but they also never fully lost their economic grip on the Outer Rim, because the Republic had no real way of taking it from them without a war neither side wanted. The first meaningful test of that new relationship came almost immediately. That same year, around 24,000 BBY, the honorable union of Devouring and Tion The largest of the states that had risen from Zim's wreckage tried to expand against the Hutts. The Union's leadership saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Zim's legacy, and they wanted to reclaim some version of what he had built. The Hutts made what was at the time a remarkable decision. They allied with the Galactic Republic against the Union. The Hutts used their own agents to stir up internal instability inside Union territory and weaken Tionese forces from the inside, while Republic fleets from the core worlds engaged the Union militarily. The Union was crushed. Whatever dreams of restoring Zim's empire had been living inside de Sevro, and Tion ended there. This cooperation between the Hutts and the Republic did not turn into a lasting alliance. What it turned into was a tense coexistence. Neither side was willing to start an open war with the other, and neither side was capable of controlling the other's territory. So they settled into an arrangement. Treaties were ratified in the centuries that followed, establishing rough boundaries between Republic space and Hutt space. A trade route called the Utmian Pabul was discovered that linked Republic frontier territory to Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa, setting up the commercial artery that would define Hutt Republic economic relations for ages. Meanwhile, the Hutt Empire continued its aggressive expansion into the Outer Rim, reaching the peak of its imperial power during this stretch. Over the millennia that followed, the Hutts built throne worlds for each major clan, developed the trade route infrastructure that would define Hutt space all the way up to the catastrophe of 15,000 BBY, and settled into what looked like a stable, long-term dominance of the region. But underneath all of that prosperity, the old clan rivalries that Kossak had briefly managed to unite during the Zim Wars were still there. They had not gone away. They had just been waiting. And the next great crisis the Hutts would face would not come from Zim's successors. It would not come from the Republic. It would come from the Hutts themselves. For 10,000 years after the fall of Zim, the Hutt Empire ruled the Outer Rim without any real challenger. Then, the empire destroyed itself. Around 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, something erupted inside the Hutt Empire that no outside force had ever been able to accomplish. The clans turned on each other, all of them, at every level. And the conflict that followed, which later historians would call the Hutt Cataclysms, came so close to wiping the species out that the survivors would spend the next 15,000 years organizing their entire civilization around making sure it never happened again. The strange part is that we do not actually know what started it. Historical records from this period were either scrambled beyond usefulness or destroyed on purpose, which is a suspicious thing on its own. The Hutts themselves seem to have gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody ever read a detailed account of how the Cataclysms began. What we are left with is fragmentary evidence and informed guesses. Economic competition between the Khajidics is almost certainly part of it. Religious schisms within Hutt culture could have played a role. Succession disputes among the ancient warrior clans, some of which had been feuding with each other since the earliest days of Varl, were likely a major factor. Resource scarcity after thousands of years of aggressive expansion probably contributed as well. The honest answer is that all of those pressures were sitting there at once, and something in the mix caused them to ignite simultaneously. What we do know with certainty is how the fighting looked. This was clan against clan. Ancient warrior lineages turning the full weight of their military machines against other Hutts. The same kind of assets that had been used to conquer alien species for 10,000 years were now being used to end rival clans. And the Cataclysms was not a single battle or even a single war. It was a series of devastating conflicts that rolled across Hutt space over an extended period, each one feeding the next, each one pulling more clans into the fighting until the entire imperial structure was burning from the inside. The Desiligic clan, whose early history we have already covered, provides one of the clearest surviving case studies of what this period looked like from the inside. The records suggest Desiligic suffered badly during the Cataclysms. Multiple enemy clans reportedly banded together to settle old scores, which tells you how long some of those grudges had been quietly building. Desiligic had spent the imperial era becoming wealthy and influential, and a significant number of rival clans apparently wanted to see them knocked down from that position. Whatever Desiligic lost during the Cataclysms, the clan would not forget it. What Desiligic did afterward is more interesting than what they lost. They were among the first clans to adopt the new philosophies that emerged from the ashes of the Cataclysms, using their scheming instincts to rebuild their wealth and prestige faster than any rival. That head start defined Hutt politics for the next 15,000 years. Their throne world, Kor Desiligic, was established in the Butana Hutta region of Hutt space during the rebuilding era, and the Rasmal Valley Palace became one of the most revered estates in all of Hutt territory. That palace, named for the legendary early Hutt, who had defeated 8 rival clans to claim the original Desiligic land, housed the oldest clan artifacts and records that had survived the Cataclysms at all. Desiligic rebuilt fast, and they rebuilt on a foundation of memory. Now here is the part of this story that is hardest to describe, because the scale of what happened to the Hutt's physical world is almost beyond belief. Varl was destroyed in the fullest possible sense of that word. This was not damage or partial ruin. It was complete obliteration of everything that had made the planet livable. Whether it happened through orbital bombardment, exchanges of weapons of mass destruction, or the Hutt's own Planechanga railguns being turned on their own worlds, the ancient homeworld did not survive the Cataclysms. Its atmosphere was torn away. Its moons were reduced to asteroid fields. Its oceans evaporated. The green paradise of Hutt mythology, the world they had claimed was given to them by the gods Evona and Ardos, became a dead, irradiated rock. And Varl was not the only casualty. Multiple ancient Hutt colony worlds were rendered barren and incapable of sustaining life during this period. The damage was regional. Entire ecosystems were wiped out because Hutt clans decided to use the kinds of weapons that did not distinguish between military targets and everything else. The Empire did not survive. The ancient Hutt Empire that had dominated the Outer Rim for 10,000 years, that had survived Zim and coexisted with the rising Republic, collapsed under the weight of its own civil war. Most of the old imperial military was destroyed, either in combat or in the planetary devastations that accompanied the worst of the fighting. Many Hutt clans were wiped out entirely. Only a handful of powerful Khajidics came through the other side with enough population and resources to keep going. The surviving clans finally arrived at a realization that the Hutt species had apparently been unwilling to accept for 10,000 years. Another round of this kind of warfare would not just weaken the Hutts, it would wipe them out as a species. The entire species could be extinguished if the next generation decided to settle scores the same way the Cataclysms generation had. A few of the most powerful remaining clans gathered up their surviving prisoner species, including the Talanda Till and another servant species called the Vipits, and began preparing to abandon Varl entirely. Before we get to where they went, There is something important about how the Hutts treated the ruined homeworld afterward. They never stopped treating Varl as sacred. For the next 15,000 years, Hutt patrol ships circled the dead world to keep outsiders away. Other ships were forbidden from approaching. After the Yuuzhan Vong War millennia later, Hutts would refuse to even discuss Varl's final fate in any serious detail because the topic remained too taboo. The system was eventually quarantined entirely due to dangerous creatures that had somehow survived or developed in the ruins. But the reverence for Varl as an ancestral site never faded across the entire lifespan of Hutt civilization. Poets, philosophers, and historians throughout the millennia that followed continued to reference Varl as the dead heart of the species, a sacred ruin too holy to reclaim or rebuild. Here is why the Cataclysms matter more than almost anything else in Hutt history. More than the defeat of Zim, more than the conquests of the early empire. The Cataclysms ended the era of the Hutts as open conquerors and warlords, and they set the stage for everything the galaxy would later recognize as a Hutt. The crime lord, shadow economy operator. The gangster running smuggling networks out of Nar Shaddaa. The palace-bound schemer like Jabba. None of that existed before the Cataclysms. All of it emerged out of the reform that came after. The Hutts learned one specific lesson, and they learned it permanently. Open warfare between their own clans was existentially dangerous. Any future rivalry had to be conducted through assassination, economic warfare, sabotage, and proxy violence. A Hutt clan could still try to ruin another Hutt clan. That part never stopped. But doing it through bombardment was now off the table forever. There was also a psychological consequence that shaped the Hutts going forward. They had survived yet another apocalypse. The Rakatan occupation, the ancient catastrophe that ended Varl's green era, the Cataclysms themselves. In Hutt eyes, surviving all of that was more evidence that they were meant to rule the galaxy. The arrogance that had defined them since the beginning did not get humbled by nearly ending their own species. It got reinforced. The most famous scam in the history of the Star Wars galaxy did not involve a con man, a heist, or a shady backroom deal. It involved lawyers, contracts, and an entire planet being traded away for garbage. After the Cataclysms, the surviving Hutt clans were in a position no great civilization wants to be in. Their homeworld was a dead rock. Their empire was gone. Their military was broken. And most of the species they had spent thousands of years ruling had either been wiped out in the fighting or would need to be transported somewhere new if they were going to keep being useful. So the Hutts did the only thing left to do. They loaded everyone onto the battered remains of the old Imperial fleet, including their Talanda Till and Vipit servants, and started looking for somewhere to live. What they found was a world called Evokar. It was a temperate planet in a system called YouTube, covered in lush rainforests with expansive oceans and towering mountain ranges, rich in the kinds of natural resources a displaced civilization could build a future on. And here is the thing about Evokar. The Hutts had actually visited it centuries earlier and had left the planet in the hands of its peaceful native population, a species called the Evochi. Now they were coming back, and this time they were not leaving. The Evoci were a tribal species without any reliable interstellar travel of their own. They were organized into independent tribes, which is a detail that matters more than it might sound because it meant there was no single Evoci authority the Hutts had to negotiate with. They could handle the tribes one at a time, and that is exactly what they did. Instead of invading, the Hutts brought in their Vipit lawyers, who had an established practice on a world called Ali, and their own diplomatic team led by a Hutt named Budhila Hestilik Amura. Remember that name, because Budhila is about to become one of the most important figures in all of Hutt history. The diplomats sat down with each Evosi tribe individually and offered them trinkets, and as the records later described it, useless pieces of high-technology equipment in exchange for huge stretches of land. The Evosi, having never dealt with interstellar lawyers before, accepted the trades. They signed the contracts. They gave up enormous territories for things that barely functioned. By the time the Evokai realized what had actually happened, the Hutts had secured legal ownership of almost the entire planet. Tribe by tribe, signature by signature, Evokar had been bought out from under the species that had been living on it for generations. The Evosi appealed to the Galactic Republic for help, hoping that someone with actual authority would step in and undo what had been done. The Republic looked at the paperwork and ruled that the contracts were legally binding. The Evokii had signed away their world. The Republic had no mechanism to reverse it. They were out of luck. Budhila would later point to that exact transaction as the founding example of what he called entrepreneurship. The entire planet of Evokar handed over through paperwork and trinkets with no fleets mobilized and no shots fired. That is what the Hutts, he argued, were actually good at. And that realization, along with some other lessons we are about to get into, became the seed of the philosophy that would redefine the species. The Hutts renamed their new world Nal Hutta, which means glorious jewel in Huttese. It was declared the new homeworld and the new capital of what would become known as Hutt space. The planet's fifth moon, originally a wilderness, was also claimed and would eventually be built up into a massive ecumenopolis called Nar Shaddaa, later famous across the galaxy as the Smuggler's Moon. As for the Evokii themselves, they were evicted from their ancestral land. The Hutts relocated them to Nar Shaddaa and imprisoned them, forcing them to work alongside the moon's own native population, a species called the Ganks, on building the vertical city that would eventually cover the entire moon. Some of the Evosi refused to leave. Those who stayed on Nal Hutta banded into rebel tribes and tried to harass Hutt interests on the planet itself. The Hutts defeated these rebellions one by one and eventually exterminated the resistors. The most notable uprising was led by a charismatic Evochii named Ejal, who managed to organize a meaningful resistance until someone inside his own tribe sold him out. The betrayer was rewarded with freedom and wealth. Ejal was executed in a way that was designed to be remembered, which served the Hutt's purpose of ensuring no other Evosi leader would try the same thing. The Evosi on Nar Shaddaa did not fare any better in the long run. Exposed for generations to the moon's industrial pollutants and the experimental technologies that flowed through the vertical city, the Evosi population slowly mutated. Over centuries, they became degenerate forms of what they had once been, eventually living as feral creatures in the undercity of the moon they had been forced to build. A species that had governed an entire planet a few centuries earlier was now a subterranean population of something barely recognizable as what it had started as. The Hutts, meanwhile, were reshaping their new world to match their biological preferences. Long-term strip mining operations were carried out across Nal Hutta's surface. Factories and industrial plants were built. Urban development was concentrated on Nar Shaddaa, while Nal Hutta itself became more of a private estate world for Hutt clans. Within a few centuries, Nal Hutta's atmosphere had turned into yellowish sulfuric gas. Its surface was covered in marshes, stagnant pools, and lavish hut palaces, and the greasy, warm rain that fell across the planet made most non-huts miserable. For the huts, this was an upgrade. The hot, humid, chemically saturated environment was much closer to their evolutionary comfort zone than the original green version of the world had ever been. Their corrosion-resistant skin meant the toxic atmosphere was not a problem for them. For nearly 11,000 years after this transformation, Nar Shaddaa, and to a lesser extent Nal Hutta itself, would rival Coruscant as the major hub of interstellar trade in the galaxy. The Hutts had not rebuilt an empire. They had built something more durable than an empire. And that brings us back to Budhila, because the entire philosophical revolution that reshaped Hutt civilization after the Cataclysms came from him. Budhila drew his inspiration from two places. The first was the Evokar transaction itself, which showed what the Hutts could accomplish through paperwork. The second was looking back at how the Hutts had actually beaten Jim thousands of years earlier. It had not been the open fleet battles at Vontor that had ended Jim. It had been the sabotage, the subterfuge, the manipulation of his ego, the privateer raids on his supply lines. The Hutts had always been more effective when they fought indirectly than when they fought head-on. Budhila took those lessons and built a complete philosophy around them. He called it Khajidik. The word Khajidik literally translates in Huttese to the means by which we prosper, and it is also linked to an informal Hutt saying that someone is going to have it, so why should it not be them? The philosophy it described was simple in its core idea. Open warfare and direct conquest were the methods of lesser species. Hutts were better than that. Hutts should dominate the galaxy through economic control, through indirect influence, through infiltration of institutions, through cunning and manipulation. Competition between Hutt clans was not discouraged, it was celebrated, because fierce rivalry would weed out the weak and keep the species sharp. But that competition had to happen through business, through political maneuvering, through sabotage and proxy violence, through anything except open fleet battles. The Hutts would not try to rule humanity and other species through prisoner armies anymore. They would rule them from within instead, through trade, bribery, blackmail, and crime. The galaxy would come to think of them as crime lords, and in a very literal sense, that is exactly what Budhila had designed them to become. Budhila also founded the body that would enforce the new system. He created the Hutt Council of Elders, also known as the Hutt Grand Council or the Hutt Ruling Council, specifically to prevent another cataclysm from ever happening. The council's job was to mediate disputes between clans, oversee the activities of the Khajidiks, and keep internal rivalries from escalating back into open warfare. Each Khajidik, which could mean either a Hutt clan, a business enterprise, or in the grandest sense, the idealized superclan that Hutts believed they were destined to become, was led by a figure called a Khajidii or a Lorda. Clans operated openly, claiming leadership over dozens of worlds at a time, which made the Hutts an unusual kind of criminal organization in that most of the galaxy's crime syndicates operated in secret. The Vodrans, still bound by the old Treaty of Vontor, organized their own society into Hutt-style Khajidiks that were wholly subservient to Hutt ones. Budhila's name was honored thousands of years later in a location called Budhila Plaza on Nar Shaddaa, and the two Sanskrit-derived elements of his name both carried the meaning of wisdom, reflecting the near-sage status he held in Hutt cultural memory for the rest of their history. The old Hutt Empire was gone for good. What stood in its place was the Hutt cartel, an oligarchic, criminal economic empire that was about to survive everything the galaxy could possibly throw at it for the next 15,000 years. About 3,000 years after the Cataclysms, the Hutts ran into the first outside force since Zim that genuinely wanted to see them wiped out as a species. And for the first time in galactic history, the threat coming for them was not a warlord or a rival empire, but a religion that had taken over the largest government in the galaxy. Around 11,987 years before the Battle of Yavin, the sitting Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, a figure named Perslia, was assassinated. With the Chancellor's seat suddenly empty, a fanatical religious group called the Pious Dia moved in and took over the Republic. That is worth sitting with for a second. This was not a normal political party winning an election. This was a cult taking over the largest government in the galaxy, and nobody was really able to stop it. The Pious Dia worshipped a single deity they called the Goddess. The core belief behind the whole movement was human supremacy. Alien species across the galaxy were viewed as lesser beings, and the Outer Rim in particular was seen as a region of chaos that had to be cleaned up before the galaxy could reach what they considered its proper state. A senator named Contispex became the political face of the cult. And once Perslia was gone, Contispex stepped into the Chancellor's seat as Contispex I. That moment kicked off a dynasty. For roughly 1,000 years after his election, the Republic would be ruled by a line of Contispex chancellors, each one pushing the cult's agenda forward. Once they had the office, the Pious Dia started reshaping the rest of the Republic government from the inside. They removed their opponents from important government jobs, handed those positions out to loyal cult members, and over time made a lot of those jobs hereditary so that entire families were locked in to serving the faith. The whole government machine slowly turned into an extension of the religion. By the 11,500s BBY, the Republic Navy itself had essentially become a Pious Dia stronghold, crewed by the children and grandchildren of sailors who had converted generations earlier. The ships they flew reflected the change. Their navy used massive vessels called cathedral ships, which worked as warships and as mobile religious temples at the same time. The fleet that had once been built to defend the Republic was now more like a moving crusade, with religion built directly into the hardware. The Hutts had a problem. In 11,965 BBY, Contispex I officially ordered an invasion of Hutt space, framed as a defensive strike against what he called the Hutt chaos beyond the Rim. This was the first Pious Dia crusade, and because the cult believed the galaxy needed to be constantly cleansed, this was also just the opening move. What followed was more than 1,000 years of religious crusades against the Hutts and other alien civilizations. At least 34 full crusades were launched over that span, which works out to roughly one new crusade every 30 years, for an entire millennium of wave after wave of Republic fleets pouring into alien territory. The Hutts were not in good shape to absorb this. They were still rebuilding after the Cataclysms, roughly 3,000 years in the past by this point. And the cartel structure that Budila had designed was built for business competition and clan politics, not for pushing back a massive Republic navy driven by pure belief. Pious Dia forces conquered a large chunk of territory along the Utmian-Pabul hyperlane, the trade route we talked about earlier that had been set up between Republic space and Hutt space during the era of peaceful coexistence. That trade route now became an invasion corridor. The Pious Dia pushed deep into Hutt territory along it, taking world after world. To make the whole thing easier to sell to regular Republic citizens, Contispex also blamed the Hutts for prisoner raids against isolated Republic colonies on the border. Whether those raids were actually happening the way he described them, the propaganda worked. Public support for the Crusades held strong across generations. The Third Paez Dia Crusade, ordered by Contispex II in 11,939 BBY, was another direct invasion of Hutt space, this one hitting the southern end of Hutt territory from a world called Ord Gustald and pushing towards Sneeve and Chalakta. A few decades later, in 11,920 BBY, the Fourth Crusade launched. By that point, the Paez Dia Republic's borders had pushed out as far as Delacrix, Nimban, Quen, and Toydaria, all deep in what had previously been secure Hutt space. These were no longer just raids. These were full takeovers of Hutt worlds carried out under a religious banner. The Jedi Order had seen enough. In 11,933 BBY, right after the Third Crusade, the Jedi formally stepped away from the Republic. They retreated to their academy world of Ossus and cut ties with the corrupted government, refusing to serve a republic that had become a tool for wiping out entire species. Not every Jedi agreed with that choice. Some rogue members of the Order actually joined the Paez Dia and became known as the Order of the Terrible Glare on a world called Ghan. Others went in the opposite direction and ran their own private wars against Paez Dia forces. The Order was split in several directions over how to handle the crisis, and the decision to step away, which they called the recusal, was a controversial call that would take centuries to reverse. The last major crusade against the Hutts, the 34th Paez Dia Crusade, was launched in 11,057 BBY. The gap between the First Crusade and the 34th is worth noticing, roughly 900 years. That is how long the Paez Dia's obsession with ending the Hutts actually lasted as an active Republic policy. Generations of Hutts were born, lived their long lifespans, and passed away during this era. The war against them was a permanent feature of galactic politics across that entire stretch. The Hutts survived it because they made the right alliance at the right time. Around 11,820 BBY, during what is called the Sixth Alsakan conflict, internal tensions inside the Republic finally broke the whole thing open. The core world of Alsakan split off from the Paez Dia Republic, taking the Perlemian trade route territories that had come up earlier in this story along with it. Alsakan then quietly started reaching out to alien powers that had been targeted by the Crusades, including species like the Duros and the Hergliks, and most importantly, for our purposes, the Hutts. Alsakan offered these species protection from the Paez Dia in exchange for a strategic alliance against Coruscant. The Hutts, still under constant religious attack after 2 centuries of crusades, accepted right away. The coalition that formed was not strong enough to end the Paez Dia on its own, but it was strong enough to hold the line. For centuries afterward, the alliance against the Paez Dia waged on and off warfare with the Republic, keeping what was left of Hutt territory safe and stopping the cult's expansion from going any further. The Hutts also used this long defensive period to build up their own fleets, stockpiling warships that some legend sources would later credit with helping Hutt space survive a very different invasion thousands of years down the line, during the Yuuzhan Vong War. The Paez Dia eventually destroyed itself from the inside. By the 11,100s BBY, the cult's expansion had stalled and the movement turned inward. The Pyesdia launched inquisitions to hunt down anyone inside their own ranks who was not a true believer, which caused huge suffering across the Republic's own population and started eating away at the cult's grip on power. Representatives from a peaceful species called the Kamasi traveled to the Jedi stronghold on Ossus and finally convinced the Jedi Order to end their recusal. The Jedi agreed to come back. Working with the Kamasi and the Alsakani, they engineered a religious split from inside the Pyesdia itself, a breakaway group that called themselves the Renunciates. In 10,967 BBY, the 7th Alsakan conflict broke out, which is also remembered as the Renunciation. Renunciate forces clashed with Pyesdia loyalists at worlds called Vontor, Ixtlar, and Cyrilia, backed by the Jedi, the Alsakani, the Duros, the Hergliks, and the Hutts. At the same time, a neutral galactic organization called the Bureau of Ships and Services pulled off one of the quietest sabotage operations in galactic history. They secretly planted rogue codes in the Republic Navy's navigation computers that caused Pyesdia ships to jump randomly into hyperspace and become permanently lost. Entire fleets disappeared into nothing because the systems that were supposed to guide them home had been tampered with by a body that was supposed to be strictly neutral. At the Battle of Uquine, Renunciate forces finished off what was left of the Pyesdia fleet. The Jedi captured Contispex the 19th aboard his flagship, the Flame of Synthara, and took him to Kamas, where he stood trial and was thrown in prison. Jedi Grand Master Biel Ductavis then took the position of Supreme Chancellor, officially ending the Pyesdia era in 10,966 BBY. After almost 1,000 years of religious warfare against the alien species of the galaxy, the Crusades were finally over. The Hutts had come through it as a surviving power in the Outer Rim, bent in places but not broken. The resentment between the core worlds and the Outer Rim that this era planted into galactic politics would last for thousands of years afterward, shaping everything from trade disputes to later political alliances. And within a few thousand more years, the Hutts would do something that would have been literally unthinkable at the height of the Pyesdia era. They would put one of their own Hutts into the same Chancellor's seat that Contispex had once used to try to wipe them out. The Republic that came out the other end of the Pyesdia era was a very different place than the one that had gone into it. 1,000 years of religious warfare against alien species had burned down most of the trust the Republic had built with the Outer Rim. Alliances were broken. Trade routes had been disrupted. Whole regions of the galaxy had spent generations watching Republic fleets arrive under a religious banner and leave with pieces of their territory. Fixing all of that was going to take time, and the new government had to rebuild from almost zero. Relations with the Hutts were still deeply strained, but the open hostility that had defined the Crusades was gone. One thing that made this new era different is the direction the Republic itself chose to move in. The government became significantly more tolerant of alien species and alien cultures, partly because it had to be in order to rebuild the alliances it had burned, and partly as a direct reaction to how ugly the previous regime had gotten. The Republic was actively trying to prove it was something different. And that opening, that willingness to deal with alien species on fair terms, eventually made something possible that nobody would have believed possible during the height of the Pyesdia era. A Hutt would not just join the Republic. A Hutt would lead it. This stretch of galactic history, from roughly 9,000 to 8,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, came to be known as the Reunitus period. It was remembered as an era of renewed prosperity and relative peace, a time when the galaxy was catching its breath after 1,000 years of religious warfare. And the central figure in that memory was a Hutt named Blotus. Blotus did not come out of Nal Hut-A or Nar Shaddaa. He came out of a network of mining worlds that had broken off from the remnants of the original Hutt Empire and settled into independent administration. He ran those mining worlds effectively, and somewhere along the way, he made a decision that no Hutt politician had ever really tried before. He applied for Republic membership on behalf of the worlds he administered. For a Hutt to openly seek legitimate entry into the Republic was unusual to the point of being almost unheard of. The Hutts as a species had spent most of their history treating the Republic as either a rival or a target. Blotus was doing something different. The Republic accepted. Even with the tension between the Republic and the Hutt species still sitting there in the background, Blotus's worlds were brought in as full Senate members. And once he actually got to Coruscant, Blotus started doing something even more unexpected. He turned out to be good at the job. He was charismatic in a way Hutts generally were not. He was an effective administrator, which Hutts generally were not expected to be in legitimate government contexts. And he was, by most accounts, genuinely uninterested in the kinds of criminal side operations that almost every other prominent Hutt in galactic history had run. Blotus was essentially the galaxy's first case study in what a Hutt could be when they had access to real political power and a legitimate institutional structure to work inside of. He did not match any of the stereotypes the galaxy had built up around his species over thousands of years of dealing with Hutt crime lords. He was something else entirely. Eventually, the Senate voted him Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic by an overwhelming majority. He became the first, and as far as any records show, the only Hutt to ever hold that office in all of galactic history. That by itself would be worth pausing on. Less than 2,000 years earlier, the Republic had been sending crusading fleets into Hutt space with the explicit goal of wiping out the species. Now the Republic was voting one of those same beings into the highest political office it had. Blotus served as Chancellor for 275 years. Not a single term, not a few terms. 2 centuries plus another 75 consecutive years in office, sustained by multiple re-elections, basically the full length of a healthy Hutt political career. And during that time, he actually governed. His major policy effort was a series of tax breaks designed for independent traders, which ended up triggering an economic boom on Coruscant itself and improving trade across the entire core worlds. Business picked up across the core. The overall economy grew steadily. Infrastructure across the Republic improved in measurable ways, and interspecies tolerance got better under his administration. He was also noted as a kind Hutt, which in the context of this story is a genuinely unusual description. Most Hutts in galactic history were remembered for cruelty, manipulation, or criminal excess. Blotus was remembered for being decent. His 275-year term was considered one of the most effective chancellorships in the entire history of the Republic. And this is a political body that had produced thousands of years of leaders by the time he took office. When his time finally came, Blotus passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 912. By Hutt standards, that was already a long life, and passing in his sleep was considered a gentle end even for a species that routinely lived 1,000 years or more. He had served the Republic for almost 3 centuries, guided it through one of the most prosperous stretches in its history, and walked away having proven something that most of the galaxy had considered impossible. The memory of Blotus did not fade after he was gone. Thousands of years later, during the Cold War between the Republic and the reconstituted Sith Empire, around 3653 BBY, His chancellorship was still remembered fondly enough that his favorite chair in the Senate Tower's lounge was traditionally left empty in his honor. Think about what that means. Roughly 5,000 years after his passing, people were still leaving a chair empty for him. A historian named Varl, writing in 36 ABY, more than 8,000 years after Blotus was gone, still cited him as one of the most illustrious chancellors the Republic had ever produced. While Blotus was running the Republic from Coruscant, the actual Hutt cartel back in Hutt space was doing what the actual Hutt cartel always did: running commerce operations, organizing criminal enterprises, and fighting endless clan feuds against each other. The Khajidics were operating openly inside Hutt space, each one controlling its own throne world in the Bu-Tana Hutt-A, which translated to the Garden of Hutts, each running its own imprisoned species, trade monopolies, and mercenary armies. Nal Hutt-A and Nar Shaddaa continued to function as the twin capitals of Hutt civilization. Nar Shaddaa's vertical city had grown into a full ecumenopolis, a city that covered an entire planet, which rivaled Coruscant itself as the main trade hub of the galaxy. The alliance of convenience that the Hutts had formed with Alsakan, the Duros, and the Hergliks during the Paes-Dia era was still holding. Over the millennia that followed, the Hutt cartel gradually standardized into the institutional form that most of the galaxy would eventually recognize. The ancient clans were formally organized. A ruling council sat on top of them. Khajiit and Lorda leaders ran individual Khajidiks underneath, and imprisoned armies and shadow economies reached into pretty much every underworld operation in every sector. By around 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Hutts had become serious competitors with newer criminal organizations like the Exchange, and Hutt space's borders shifted and stretched across the millennia, while the Hutts' actual economic power stayed firmly locked in place. During those same centuries, the galaxy went through some of its most famous conflicts. The Great Sith War, the Mandalorian Wars, the Jedi Civil War, and in pretty much every one of them, the Hutts did what Hutts had learned to do best after Budilah's reforms. They stayed strategically neutral, and they profited from whoever was fighting. Neutrality was the business model. Whoever was paying for ships, weapons, and supplies, the Hutts were happy to sell to. Whoever needed smuggling routes or information networks, the Hutts had those too. Wars came and wars went, and the Hutts kept making money through all of them. But a few thousand years down the line, the galaxy was going to enter one of the biggest shadow conflicts in its entire history. And for the first time in a long time, the Hutts would be forced to actually pick a side. The consequences of that choice would reshape their political position for centuries afterward. Somewhere around 3,681 years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy ran into the exact kind of event that Budilah's cartel had been designed to ride out. A massive shadow conflict broke open between the Galactic Republic and a long-hidden Sith Empire that nobody in the Republic had even known was still active. It was called the Great Galactic War, and for the Hutts, it became a test of whether 12,000 years of careful neutrality politics could actually hold up when both sides of the galaxy came calling at the same time. By this point in history, the Hutt cartel had been running the Outer Rim's underworld for roughly 12 millennia. That included smuggling operations, prisoner markets, the spice trade, and a full network of protection rackets across hundreds of worlds. The cartel had its hands in every kind of illegal business that existed, and it had been refining that operation for longer than most civilizations in the galaxy had even been around. Nar Shaddaa had become the single most important underworld hub in the galaxy, the kind of place where a smuggler could buy, sell, hide, or disappear, depending on what the situation called for. The vertical city climbed kilometers into the sky, wrapped in a permanent haze of pollution and flickering neon signs, and its trade volume actually rivaled Coruscant itself. Nal Hutta remained the political and ceremonial heart of Hutt space, with Hutt palaces, pleasure gardens, and clan estates sprawled across the planet's greasy swamps under that familiar humid sauna atmosphere. The Hutt Grand Council was still running things from Nal Hutta, overseeing the major Khajidics the galaxy would keep encountering across every era of this story. The Barish clan ran weapons deals. The Fa'athra clan ran owners and prisoner markets. The Gajali clan handled other enterprises. The Ilip clan produced Hutt scientists, including a figure named Dr. Juvad Ilip Ogorob. The Inajik clan, descended directly from the lineage of Kossak, was still training warriors at the old academy Kossak himself had founded after the fall of Zim. And of course, there were the ancient Desilijik and Besadii, the two most famous Hutt clans in all of Legends history, both of them still powerful, both of them still clashing with each other. Budilah's original system was still doing what it had been built to do. The Khajidics competed with each other internally, and the ruling council existed to keep that competition from escalating into another cataclysm. Then, the Sith Empire returned. When the long-hidden Sith Empire emerged from the unknown regions of the galaxy and launched its war on the Republic, the Hutts immediately found themselves in an awkward political spot. The Sith Emperor, a figure called Vishit, had spent centuries quietly preparing for this war without ever pulling the Hutts into any of his planning. He had never offered them a seat at the table, and he had not even pretended to consult them before the fighting started. And the Hutts, who genuinely did believe they deserved a seat at the table of any major galactic power play, took that personally. The Republic saw an opportunity. If the Hutts felt snubbed by the Sith, maybe they could be brought onto the Republic side. Republic diplomats went to work offering trade concessions, political recognition, and all the usual carrots, trying to pull the cartel into an open alliance against the Sith. And it almost worked. What the Republic did not see coming was a quiet operation run by the Imperial Ministry of Intelligence. Sith agents went into Hutt space and systematically blocked every single Republic approach before it could land. They used subterfuge and bribery and blackmail, identifying which Hutt officials were leaning toward the Republic and applying exactly the right kind of pressure to flip them back. A Jedi historian named Nost Dural would later record the whole episode in his writings, noting that the Hutt's neutrality during this period was not actually a free choice the cartel had made on its own. It was a neutrality that had been engineered for them by Imperial spies. Rather than push the cartel into an open fight, the Sith offered a deal. Imperial representatives sat down with the Hutts and brokered a formal agreement that came to be known as the Hutt Imperial Treaty. The terms were simple. As the Sith Empire kept expanding through the Great Galactic War and the Cold War that followed, the Hutts would be allowed to keep their own territory, their own government, and their public stance of neutrality. In exchange, the cartel and every clan and subsidiary underneath it would quietly agree to never actually help the Republic. The Hutts could pretend to be neutral in public. Behind the scenes, they would make sure none of their resources ever went toward the Republic side of the war. The cartel stayed neutral all the way through the end of the Great Galactic War in 3653 BBY and through the Cold War that came after it, which is what most of the criminal underworld did during that era. And this arrangement set up one of the most important patterns in Hutt political behavior for the next several thousand years. The system was not perfect, though, and the first real stress test came around 3643 BBY on a planet called Quesh. 3 Hutt families broke the terms of the treaty by quietly helping Republic scientists who were working on Quesh to synthesize adrenal stimulants for Republic military use. When the Sith Empire found out, Imperial forces showed up and effectively forced the rest of the Grand Hutt Council to publicly brand those 3 families as traitors. The cartel then had to reluctantly join the Sith in attacking Quesh, rooting out Republic agents and handing the planet's chemical resources over for Imperial use. The Quesh incident is a small moment in galactic history, but it is a revealing one. It showed exactly how effectively the Sith could use Hutt's self-interest against Hutt unity. The Council could be pressured into selling out individual clans by outside powers, and that dynamic was going to repeat over and over again across the rest of Hutt history. The cartel's collective interests always came ahead of any specific family's interests when an outside empire was applying pressure. In the middle of all this, the leadership of the cartel itself was shifting. A Hutt named Karaga, the Unyielding, held the title of Supreme Mogul, which was the term for the overall leader of the entire cartel. Karaga was eventually eliminated, and in the vacuum that followed, another Hutt named Toboro took the position of Supreme Mogul, with a Hutt named Sajin serving as his right hand. Toboro looked at the state of the galaxy around him and came to a conclusion that almost no Hutt leader since Kossak had seriously considered. Both the Republic and the Sith Empire were exhausted after decades of war. The Sith Emperor had apparently fallen. The 2 major galactic powers were weaker than they had been in centuries. Toboro decided that the moment had come for the Hutt cartel to become a genuine 3rd galactic power, operating openly on the same level as the Republic and the Empire. He picked a target that fit the ambition: a planet called Makeb, which contained deposits of an extremely rare mineral called Isotope 5. Isotope 5 was the kind of resource that rewrites the balance of power in a galaxy. It could warp electromagnetic and gravitational fields and generate enormous amounts of energy from a single gram. Whoever controlled it would have a serious military and economic advantage over everyone else. Toboro was going to take Makeb, extract as much Isotope 5 as possible, and use it to launch the cartel into real galactic power status. This was the biggest political and military gamble any Hutt had attempted since Kossak faced Zim over 22,000 years earlier. And unlike Kossak, Toboro was about to find out that his gamble had been a serious miscalculation. In 3638 BBY, Toboro paid off Makeb's mercenary defense force, a group called the Interstellar Regulators, and launched a full invasion of the planet. The cartel blockaded the Makeb system and immediately began drilling straight into the planet's core to extract the Isotope 5, with no concern whatsoever for what the drilling would do to Makeb itself. Both the Republic and the Sith Empire noticed what was happening and sent forces to intervene. The Republic, under Chancellor Saresh, wanted to stop the Hutts entirely. The Empire, under commanders like Darth Mar and Darth Asina, wanted to grab the Isotope 5 for their own war machine. Republic forces allied with a local Makeb resistance leader named Shalim Avesta, while Imperial forces pursued the isotope independently. The drilling was tearing the planet apart. Massive groundquakes rolled across Makeb's surface, and the planet itself was close to breaking open. Both the Republic and the Empire shifted from fighting each other to urgently trying to shut down the Hutt operation before Makeb collapsed. Sajin, Toboro's right hand, confronted Republic and Imperial forces personally while piloting a mech suit powered by Isotope 5. When Sajin was brought down, his mercenary commanders made one final decision. Rather than let the secret of Isotope 5 reach the galaxy, they turned Makeb's mining lasers on the planet itself and triggered a groundquake big enough to end the whole world. Toboro himself was eliminated or removed from power during the operation, depending on which account you read. Either way, the cartel's bid to become a true galactic superpower collapsed in the most literal sense possible. The Hutts were pushed right back into the shadows of the underworld, which was where they had always operated best anyway. After the Makeb disaster, the cartel went back to its traditional role. The largest and most powerful criminal organization in the galaxy, but never again openly trying to compete for political power with the major interstellar empires. The Barish clan reached the peak of its influence during this Cold War era, running arms deals and rare artifact auctions out of Nal Hut-Ah. Centuries later, Barish would be weakened when a supervolcano erupted on their throne world Kor Barish and covered the main continent in ash. Other clans rose and fell around them across the centuries. But the basic governmental structure Budila had designed 15,000 years earlier kept humming along. The Hutts survived every political configuration the galaxy threw at them and kept taking their cut. And roughly 3,000 years after the Makeb disaster, somewhere in the desert worlds of the Outer Rim, a new Hutt was about to be born into a Disiligic clan that had existed since before the Galactic Republic. His name was going to become a synonym for the entire Hutt species across the whole galaxy, and that name was Jabba. For most people outside of Star Wars, the word Hutt does not bring up Kossak or Budhila or the Cataclysms or any of the things we have spent 10 sections building. It brings up one specific enormous slug sitting on a throne on Tatooine with a chained princess next to him. And that Hutt's full story actually starts almost 600 years before any of the famous things he becomes known for ever happen. Jabba Ture was born around 600 years before the Battle of Yavin, which means he was roughly 596 when he showed up in A New Hope, and about 600 when he was finally taken out in Return of the Jedi. He was born on Nal Hut-Ah, the greasy swamp world we talked about earlier, and he was born directly into the ruling family of one of the two oldest and most powerful Hutt clans in the galaxy. His father was Zorba Disiligic Tiura, who was running the Disiligic clan at the time. Zorba is worth picturing for a second because he was one of the rare Hutts in all of galactic history who actually had hair, the result of some kind of old genetic throwback. A hairy Hutt. That detail alone tells you the household Jabba grew up in was a little unusual. Zorba's siblings made the Disiligic family tree even more intertwined with clan leadership than the name alone suggests. His sister Giliak was another major Disiligic figure in her own right, and she is going to become Jabba's aunt in every sense of the word that matters. Zorba also had siblings named Ebor, Zero, and Pazda. Zero in particular is someone you want to remember, because he is going to betray the entire family in a way that reshapes Hutt politics during the Clone Wars. Jabba was not just born into a powerful clan. He was born into the living leadership of a powerful clan, surrounded by assassinations, dirty deals, and the cruel Khajidic politics Budhila had designed 15,000 years earlier. What Jabba picked up from all of this early on is the lesson that defined how he did business for the rest of his life. Real power did not come from brute force. Real power came from controlling the people who already had power. Bribe the right official. Own the right contract. Make the right politician owe you something. Young Jabba figured out the structure of the Khajiitic system faster and more intuitively than most of his peers, and he started building his personal web of influence almost as soon as he was physically capable of moving around and talking to people. His mother apparently left a very strong mark on him. This is a small detail, but it is a revealing one. Years later, when Jabba was running his Tatooine court as a middle-aged crime lord, by Hutt standards, he forced an Askajian dancer named Yarna Dal Gargan to wear a specific style of makeup so that she would resemble his mother. Whatever his feelings about his mother actually were, they were strong enough that he was still projecting them onto the people around him hundreds of years later. Young Jabba had what can only be described as extraordinary business instincts. He was possibly the sharpest criminal mind of his entire generation of Hutts, which is saying something given how many of them were being raised inside the cartel at the same time. While still considered a child by Hutt standards, which given their lifespan could mean he was already over a century old, he was running spice smuggling operations and arms trades. He was cutting deals with mercenaries and owners. He was using bribes strategically to build influence both inside the Disiligic clan and outside of it, a pattern he kept running for the rest of his life with almost mechanical consistency. Jabba built himself into a powerful crime lord inside the Disiligic structure well before his father ever stepped aside, eventually earning his own seat on the Grand Hutt Council, which is the body Budhila had created to mediate between clans all those thousands of years earlier. He also got himself affiliated with the Crymora Syndicate, an older criminal organization that intersected with Hutt operations across the Outer Rim. By the time he was genuinely recognized as a major player, Jabba had influence in multiple criminal networks, multiple Hutt clans, and multiple sectors. At some point, he decided he wanted a planet of his own. The world he picked is the one everybody already knows, the desert planet called Tatooine. Tatooine was perfect for what Jabba wanted to become. It was remote and poor, and it sat almost entirely outside any kind of meaningful Republic enforcement. It was the ideal environment for running every kind of business the Hutts specialized in, and the lack of oversight meant almost no one was going to ask questions about what happened there. But before Jabba could run it, he had to take it from the Hutts, who already had a foothold there. 5 different Hutt clans were actively working Tatooine at this point, including a Khajiitic called the Faljozik clan, which controlled most of the planet's exports before Jabba arrived, and the Besadii clan, whose operations were being run by a major figure named Gardula the Elder. Jabba set up his headquarters in what became the most famous Hutt palace in all of Star Wars. It was originally a monastery belonging to a reclusive religious order called the Baomar monks, located deep in the northern Dune Sea. Jabba took it over, fortified it, and converted the old monastery into a crime lord's stronghold. From that palace, he declared himself the ruler of Tatooine's underworld, and he backed up the declaration with the exact same strategy he had been using his whole life. He bribed every local official who mattered, whether that was a customs officer in Mos Espa, a security chief in Mos Eisley, or a port authority or magistrate in any of the other towns. If a position on Tatooine had any influence over smuggling routes, gambling operations, or spice trade, Jabba made sure whoever held that position was on his payroll. He ran the full Hutt portfolio out of that palace, which meant gambling, spice smuggling, piracy operations, arms dealing, and prisoner trading all happening at the same time. Everything the species had been doing for 15,000 years, run at an unusual level of ambition and efficiency because Jabba was simply better at the work than most of his peers. Gambling was a particularly big part of the operation, especially through the Mos Espa Grand Arena, where Jabba built his own grandstand specifically so he could personally control the gambling, the concessions, and the VIP access during pod races. Pod racing was also a Deselegic family business at a larger scale. The clan controlled several of the most important pod racing courses in this era, including the Bunta Eve Classic, which, remember, was named after Bunta the Hutt, Kossak's ally during the Zim Wars 25,000 years earlier. They also controlled a course called the Ando Overland on Ando Prime. Jabba personally presided over the Bunta Eve Classic, greeting the crowds and signaling the start of each race, although by most accounts he actually fell asleep during the racing itself and cared only about the gambling side. The corporate sector authority repeatedly tried to take control of Ando Prime away from Deselegic and failed every time, which shows how locked in the clan's grip on high-stakes pod racing actually was. Between Tatooine and Ando Prime, Deselegic had financial control over two major worlds through pod racing alone, completely separate from the smuggling networks. Meanwhile, back on Nal Hutta, Zorba was still technically running the Deselegic clan, and he had been running it for nearly 600 years at this point. Zorba was, by pretty much every account that survived, an inept and outlandish leader. He was famous for strange schemes and for mismanaging the clan's finances. Very few Deselegic Hutts actually supported him, although none of them ever successfully pushed him out during his long term in charge. The thing that kept Zorba in place was partly inertia and partly that he was deeply sentimental about his family, especially about Jabba, even though Jabba himself and Jiliak both privately thought Zorba was a terrible leader. The end of Zorba's run came from outside the clan entirely. During the Separatist crisis leading into the Clone Wars, Republic law enforcement caught Zorba in 27 BBY for illegal gemstone mining. He was sentenced to prison on a world called Kip. Jabba tried to bribe him out, because of course he did, but the bribery attempts failed. With Zorba locked up on Kip and unable to run anything, the clan's leadership passed over to Jiliak, Zorba's sister and Jabba's aunt. Jabba inherited the bulk of Zorba's actual holdings and criminal operations, which meant that for the first time in his life, he was operating without his father's interference at all. Jiliak running the clan and Jabba inheriting Zorba's portfolio did hurt Deselegic's pod racing interests in the short term. Pod racing was also in a general decline during this era, which compounded the problem. But Jabba himself was rising fast. By 32 BBY, right around the era of the invasion of Naboo, he was the undisputed crime lord of Tatooine, powerful enough to preside over the Bunta Eve Classic as the actual face of the planet. His palace was fortified. His smuggling network stretched across the Outer Rim. His bounty hunter network already included names like Greedo and, eventually, Boba Fett. And his personal army inside the palace was made up of Gamorrean guards, Nikto enforcers, Klatooinian bodyguards, and Weequay mercenaries, which is a detail that matters more than it might look at first. Those are the exact species the Hutts had bound into servitude at Vontor 25,000 years earlier. Jabba's personal security in his Tatooine palace was, in a literal sense, still being drawn from the same treaty Kossak had signed with Baradam Beg before the Republic even existed. Gardulla the Elder was still active on Tatooine throughout this era, running Besadai operations and openly competing with Jabba for influence on the planet. At one point, Gardulla owned a pair of prisoners named Shmi and Anakin Skywalker, before eventually losing them to a junk dealer named Watto in a pod race bet. Anakin Skywalker, the future Darth Vader, was briefly owned by a Hutt. That is a detail of the Star Wars timeline that is easy to miss and almost hard to believe. Jabba at this point was formally styled as His Excellency Jabba de Silajik Tiur of Nal Hutta, Eminence of Tatooine. That title recognized him both as Hutt royalty and as the effective ruler of an entire world. By the time the Clone Wars were about to break out, Jabba was genuinely one of the most powerful gangsters in the galaxy, sitting at the center of smuggling lanes, bounty networks, and planetary political control. And the Galactic Republic, despite officially considering him a criminal, was about to have to sit down with him as an equal. The Clone Wars are one of the most famous conflicts in the entire Star Wars timeline, and most fans remember them for the Jedi, the clones, the separatist droid armies, and the fall of Anakin Skywalker. What a lot of people forget is that the Hutts were sitting right in the middle of the whole thing, and the war could not really be fought without dealing with them first. When the war broke out in 22 BBY between the Galactic Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, Jabba's influence over the Outer Rim, particularly over its hyperspace lanes, made him one of the most strategically important figures outside of either government. The Hutts controlled the trade routes across the Outer Rim. They controlled the smuggling corridors running through it, and they controlled the gaps in the map where Republic and Separatist ships could or could not move freely. Whoever ended up with Jabba's cooperation would have a huge advantage in moving fleets around the Outer Rim, and both sides of the war understood that almost immediately. Jabba's opening position was the traditional Hutt one, which was full neutrality, profit from both sides, commit to neither. The same playbook the cartel had been running since Boudillah designed it 15,000 years earlier. The same playbook that had gotten them through the Paez Dea Crusades and the Great Galactic War. Count Dooku, the public face of the Separatists who was secretly serving Darth Sidious, understood that neutrality was actually bad for his side in the long run. Republic forces needed Hutt cooperation more than Separatist forces did, because the Republic was the one trying to reach distant systems fast. Dooku put together a plan to either pull the Hutts into the Separatist alliance outright or to turn them into active enemies of the Republic. Either outcome worked for him. The plan needed an inside man, someone with access to the Hutt clan at a high level, someone ambitious enough to betray his own family, someone who already resented the more successful Hutts around him. And Dooku found exactly that person inside Jabba's own extended family. Zero Desilijik Tiure, Jabba's uncle, who we flagged back in the last chapter as someone to keep an eye on. Zero was the family embarrassment. He ran a nightclub on Coruscant, held the title of Master of the Hutt clan over 7 star systems, and had spent years watching his more successful relatives accumulate real power while he was stuck running a club and managing smaller operations. He had ambition, he had resentment, and he had access to the clan at a high level. Dooku offered him something Zero had been quietly wanting for decades. The plan was simple and cruel. The Separatists would kidnap Rota, Jabba's infant son, a Huttlet born to one of Jabba's consorts. Then they would frame the Jedi for the kidnapping. With Jabba's son apparently taken by the Republic, Jabba would either end up throwing the entire Hutt clan behind the Separatists out of rage, or the internal chaos would give Zero the opening he needed to take control of Jabba's criminal empire himself. And most likely, Dooku expected both outcomes at once. Separatist forces, working with Dooku's apprentice Asajj Ventress, captured Rotta and transported him to a B'omarr monastery on a remote planet called Teth. The B'omarr connection is not coincidence, by the way. The same religious order whose former home Jabba had converted into his palace on Tatooine had another monastery on Teth, and the Separatists were using it as a holding site specifically because it was the kind of remote, obscure location nobody would check. The Jedi Order picked up on the situation and sent Anakin Skywalker, now a full Jedi Knight, along with his brand new Padawan Ahsoka Tano, to find Rotta and bring him home. At the same time, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi traveled to Tatooine personally to sit down with Jabba face to face and reassure him that the Jedi were actually working on his son's rescue. Jabba, in the meantime, had been waiting through days of silence with no news. He had already sent bounty hunters to Teth on his own, and they had been returned to him piece by piece in ways he was not going to forget. He was furious. He even contacted Chancellor Palpatine directly to demand answers, which shows how serious the situation had become. Dooku then made his move. He arrived at Jabba's palace carrying a doctored holographic recording that appeared to show Jedi eliminating Rotta on Teth. It was a convincing fake. It was designed to look like proof, and Jabba, watching what he thought was the assassination of his own son, swore publicly that he was going to execute the Jedi for it. Anakin and Ahsoka got there first. The two of them reached Teth, fought through the Separatist forces holding Rotta, and brought the Huttlet back to Tatooine alive before any execution could take place. The moment Rotta was handed back to his father is one of the genuinely human beats of the Clone Wars. Because Jabba, for all the cruelty he had built his empire on, actually loved his son. Watching that enormous crime lord hold his Huttlet, who had nearly been used as a pawn in a galactic war, told you something real about the emotional life of a species most of the galaxy had written off as monsters. While all of this was happening on Tatooine, Senator Padme Amidala was running her own investigation on Coruscant. She tracked down Zero at his own nightclub, confronted him directly, and exposed his role in the whole conspiracy. Jabba, now looking at two things at once, the fact that Dooku had lied to him and the fact that his own uncle had helped set up the kidnapping of his son, made a decision that nobody would have predicted a week earlier. He signed a treaty with the Galactic Republic. Hutt-controlled hyperspace lanes would be open to Republic military ships going forward. Zero was taken into custody by the Coruscant Guard and locked up in a Republic prison. That treaty was one of the most significant diplomatic wins the Republic pulled off during the entire Clone Wars, and arguably none of it would have happened without the Jedi Order being willing to physically risk their own lives to protect a Hutt child. That matters because 25,000 years of history had taught the Hutts to never fully trust the Republic. One successful rescue, carried out by two Jedi who had no political reason to care about a Huttlet's life, started rewriting that assumption. Zero's story was not over, though. As the war dragged on, the Grand Hutt Council, meeting back in the club like smoky atmosphere of Nal Hut-Ah, came to an unsettling realization. Zero was still alive in Republic custody, and Zero was holding something. A holodiary with detailed records of every criminal operation the 5 major Hutt clans were running. If the Republic ever cracked him and got access to that information, the entire cartel's underworld business could be blown open. Zero was suddenly the single most dangerous Hutt alive, and he was sitting in a Republic prison cell with every reason to talk. The Council hired the bounty hunter Cad Bane to solve the problem. Bane freed Zero from prison through an elaborate hostage crisis at the Galactic Senate, pulled off using plans he had kidnapped from Senator Amidala's 2 protocol and astromech droids. Zero was then brought back to Nal Hutta, where he stood before the council under figures like Gardula of the Besadi clan. The council wanted to eliminate him and retrieve the holodiary. Zero, who had clearly been preparing for this exact outcome, bought himself time by revealing that the records were set up to automatically transmit to the Republic Senate if anything happened to him. The council could not eliminate him. The council also could not let him go. They threw him in a prison cell of their own and effectively locked themselves into a standoff. That is when Cy Snootles walked in. Cy Snootles was a Palawic singer and performer, Zero's estranged former lover, and by all appearances, she had come to Nal Hutta to help him escape. She got him out of his cell, out of the council's reach, and out into the swamps of Nal Hutta. Their path led them to the home of a figure named Mama the Hutt, who was Zero's own mother. Mama was enormous, even by Hutt standards, and she gave her son a ship so that he could travel to Teth and dig up the holodiary he had buried in his late father's secret grave. The Grand Hutt Council, meanwhile, had sent Obi-Wan Kenobi and Quinlan Vos to chase Zero down and capture Cad Bane. The Jedi tracked Zero to Teth and closed in. Zero actually got to the grave first and pulled the holodiary out of the ground. That is when C. Snootles revealed who she actually worked for. She had been working for Jabba the entire time, hired specifically to retrieve the holodiary and eliminate Zero before the Council or the Jedi could get to him. She shot Zero dead in front of his father's grave, took the holodiary, and returned it personally to Jabba on Tatooine. Jabba paid her well, laughed at his uncle's fate, and filed the holodiary back into Disiligic control where it belonged. With Zero gone and the cartel's secrets safely in-house, the Disiligic clan had cleaned up the single most dangerous internal threat of the entire war. Jabba had solved a family problem that had been building for years, and he had done it through a hired assassin, which is exactly what Budila's Khajidic philosophy had always said Hutts were supposed to do. But the Clone Wars had one more Hutt moment left to deliver. Near the end of the war, around 19 BBY, a former Sith Lord named Maul returned from his long exile and showed up on Nal Hutta looking for resources. Maul had built something called the Shadow Collective, a criminal and paramilitary organization he wanted to use to carve out his own power base in the galaxy. And he approached the Grand Hutt Council with a simple proposal. The Hutts would hand over Hutt space and everything inside its borders to the Shadow Collective, and in exchange, Maul would allow them to keep breathing. Jabba and the Council rejected the demand outright. A skirmish broke out immediately on Nal Hutta. Maul's forces included Mandalorian Death Watch reinforcements, his brother Savage Opress, and Death Watch leader Pre Vizsla, and they broke through the Hutt defenses fast. The Council fled, but one Hutt named Oruba was captured. Savage Opress interrogated Oruba, pulled Jabba's location on Tatooine out of him, and eliminated him. The Shadow Collective then flew straight to Tatooine and attacked Jabba's palace directly. Guards were cut down, Maul's forces pushed into the throne room. Jabba, facing Maul personally, did the only thing he could actually do in that moment. He agreed to an alliance. Hutt clan resources were handed over, and the Shadow Collective used them to briefly seize control of Mandalore, which was one of the most significant blows the Mandalorians had suffered in their entire storied history as a warrior culture. The alliance did not last long. Darth Sidious himself eventually intervened and brought Maul down personally, ending the Shadow Collective's brief run at real power. But for the Hutts, something important had just happened. An outside force had walked into Nal Hutta, defeated the Grand Council militarily, and then forced Jabba into an alliance at weapons point in his own palace. The Hutts had just been humbled by a direct military intervention for the first time in thousands of years, and the century that followed was going to give them several more chances to get used to that feeling. Jabba is the famous Hutt, but during the stretch of time we are about to cover, he was not actually the most powerful Hutt in the galaxy. That honor went to an older, larger, and genuinely terrifying clan leader named Aruk. And the quiet war Jabba fought against Aruk's family is one of the most overlooked stories in the entire Hutt saga. Around 20 BBY, in the final years of the Clone Wars, Aruk Besadi Aora, who was known across Hutt space as Aruk the Great, cooked up a new operation along with his brother Varl. The world they chose was called Ylesia, and the con they built around it was elegant in exactly the kind of way Budhila would have appreciated. Ylesia was publicly advertised as a religious sanctuary. Pilgrims from all over the galaxy were invited to come and experience spiritual enlightenment, guided by a species of Talanda Til priests. The hook was real. The Talanda Til, being evolutionary cousins of the Hutts, could perform something called the exaltation, which was essentially a mating call ritual that happened to produce addictive ecstatic sensations in outside species who experienced it. Pilgrims who went to Ylesia genuinely felt something spiritual. The fact that it was a biological trick from a different species was not something they understood. What Ylesia actually was underneath the surface was a massive slaving and spice refining operation. The pilgrims who came seeking enlightenment were imprisoned and put to work processing raw spice shipped in from Kessel. The religious addiction produced by the exaltation kept them docile and productive indefinitely because they genuinely believed they were being blessed. A Talanda Til named Teroenza served as the high priest of Ylesia, and as the operation succeeded, the colonies expanded. By the peak of the scheme, Besadai was running 6 Ylesia colonies with a 7th in the planning stages. The operation was so profitable that it did something nobody in Hutt politics had seen in a very long time. It made Besadi wealthier and more powerful than the Desiligic clan. For the first time in memory, the balance at the top of the Grand Hutt Council had tilted away from Jabba's family and over to Aruk's. And that shift is what set the whole rest of this story in motion. Before we go further, there is another Besadii figure we need to meet because he is going to dominate the second half of this chapter. Around 100 BBY, roughly a century before the events of the Clone Wars, Aruk had a child named Durga. Durga was born with a large birthmark covering one side of his face, and by Hutt cultural standards, that mark was a serious problem. Aruk's peers openly pressured him to eliminate the infant, insisting that the birthmark made Durga impure and unworthy of being raised as a Hutt. Aruk refused to do any such thing. He loved the child, and he decided to raise him as his heir, personally educating him, taking him to interclan meetings, and walking him through the Besadi budget line by line. Aruk understood something clearly about his son's situation. The birthmark was going to make Durga an outsider inside his own species, which meant that when the time came for him to take over Besadi, he was going to have to be twice as ruthless and twice as cunning as any other Hutt in the galaxy just to hold the position. By the Separatist crisis, Aruk was a high-ranking Besadi leader, and Durga had been groomed his entire life to eventually take over. The problem was that fate had other plans. Early in the Ylesia operation, a young pilot showed up there under an alias. He was calling himself Vik Drygo, but his real name was Han Solo. Solo was working as a smuggler for Besadii at the time, flying runs in and out of the colonies. What he did not expect was to discover the truth of what Ylesia actually was, or to fall in love with a Corellian pilgrim named Bria Tharan, who had been trapped in the Exaltation's grip. Solo and Tharan broke out of Ylesia, together with blasters going, and with arms full of stolen priceless art, which was one of the most humiliating early hits Teroenza's operation had taken. Teroenza, absolutely furious about the escape, put enormous bounties on both of their heads. Bounty hunters chased Han Solo for years because of that bounty, including Boba Fett, who actually came close to capturing Solo at one point before Lando Calrissian stepped in and pulled him out of it. But the real pressure on Besadii was building somewhere else. After Zavel passed away, Aruk had to pick a new overlord for Ylesia, and the Hutt he chose was his nephew Kibik. Aruk privately considered Kibik an incompetent fool, and almost everyone who worked with Kibik agreed. Teroenza, who was trying to run a massive slaving enterprise under Kibik's supposed supervision, was getting increasingly frustrated. Kibik was fumbling the administration. Aruk was refusing to fund the enormous bounties Teroenza wanted to keep pouring into the hunt for Han Solo and Bria Tharan. And Teroenza made a decision that was going to change everything. He started secretly reaching out to the Desiligic clan, specifically to Jabba and his aunt Giliak, who had been running Desiligic ever since Zorba was locked up on Kip. Jabba and Giliak had been chafing for years under Besadii's rise. Watching their rival clan pass them in wealth and influence was the kind of thing that demanded a response in the Khajidik system, and both of them were eager to hit back. Teroenza, from the Besadii side, offered them something extraordinary. He offered them Aruk himself. The method was cruel in exactly the way Budhila's Khajidik philosophy would have predicted. Aruk had one personal weakness that everybody close to him knew about. He had an insatiable appetite for a delicacy called Nala tree frogs, which he kept in something called a snackwarium and ate constantly. For months, Teroenza quietly shipped huge quantities of Nala tree frogs to Aruk on Nal Hutta, and those shipments were laced with a slow-acting malachite poison called X1. Aruk had no idea. He was eating his favorite food, day after day, month after month, and the poison was accumulating in his system. Around 2 to 3 BBY, roughly 15 years after the end of the Clone Wars, Aruk Besadii Aora passed away unexpectedly following the Battle of Shaddar. The exotic poison that had been sitting in his snackwarium for months had finally done its job. Jabba and Giliak had assumed that Aruk's death would throw the entire Besadii clan into chaos. What happened instead surprised them. The barely adult Durga Besadii Tai moved with a speed and decisiveness that nobody on the Desiligic side had expected. Durga did two things at once. He hired the galaxy's best forensic specialists to investigate his father's death because the suddenness of it did not sit right with him at all. And he simultaneously started fighting off rival Besadii members who wanted to use the leadership vacuum to seize control of the clan. To solve the second problem, he reached out to someone outside the Hutt system entirely. Prince Xizor of the Black Sun Crime Syndicate. Black Sun was one of the biggest criminal organizations in the galaxy outside of the Hutts themselves, and Shizor was willing to help Durga if the price was right. Very quickly, Durga's internal Besadi rivals started mysteriously disappearing. The clan was his. But the investigation into Arok's death was going nowhere. The forensic specialists had hit dead ends. So Durga went back to Shizor and made a second, far more dangerous deal. He traded Shizor the secret blueprints of Nal Huta's planetary defenses in exchange for the identity of whoever had arranged his father's poisoning. Shizor, who had his own sources across the galactic underworld, came back with the answer. It had been Clan Desiligic, engineered through the betrayal of Teroenza, from the inside of Besadi's own Ylesia operation. Durga now knew exactly who had poisoned his father. He was also now deeply compromised. He had handed the internal security of Nal Huta over to a rival crime syndicate. He was in Shizor's pocket in a way no Hutt had ever been in the pocket of an outside criminal organization. But for the first time since Arok had passed, he had a target. Around the same time, the story of Han Solo and Bria Tharan had become a rebel alliance story. Bria had joined the rebellion, risen through its ranks, and become the commander of a commando unit called Red Hand Squadron, which specialized in liberating prisoner populations from operations exactly like Ylesia. Her raids were actually starting to cut into Besadai's bottom line, and she came to the rebel leadership with a big idea: a full assault on Ylesia itself to burn the whole slaving empire to the ground. Her problem was funding. The rebellion could not afford a mission of that scale. So Bria went to an audacious source. She proposed a deal directly to Jiliak of the Desiligic clan. The rebels would carry out the Ylesia raid and destroy Besadai's operation completely, and Desiligic would fund it. In exchange, the Hutts would handle the Talanda Til priests beforehand, because the political risk was too great. But Jabba, hearing about the offer, saw what it was worth. He secretly maintained contact with Bria Tharan through a data card, quietly supporting the plan from the shadows. The raid went ahead. Han Solo and his smugglers were hired as privateers for the operation, and it worked. Besadi's Ylesia colonies were wiped out completely, but there was a twist that the smugglers did not see coming. In the aftermath of the raid, Bria's rebel troopers turned on Han and his friends under orders from Rebel Alliance leadership to confiscate all the spice and valuables for the war effort. Solo had just helped the rebels pull off one of the biggest smuggling scores in galactic history and then watched them take everything. The betrayal broke Solo's heart, and it created a financial hole that would eventually place him so deep in debt to Jabba that the consequences would follow him all the way to Cloud City. With Ylesia in ruins, Besadi's entire financial empire was gutted, and Durga, now armed with Shizor's evidence of Desiligic's guilt in his father's poisoning, made his move. He formally challenged Jiliak to a duel. Jabba, watching from the sidelines, made the coldest possible calculation. Either outcome benefited him directly. If Durga was eliminated, Desiligic's biggest Hutt rival was gone. If Jiliak was eliminated, Jabba himself inherited full control of Clan Desiligic. So he stood back. He did not intervene. He let it play out. Durga ended the aging Jiliak in the duel. That made him officially the new leader of Clan Besadi with a confirmed vengeance strike under his belt, and it simultaneously handed Jabba everything he had been waiting for. With Giliac gone and Zorba still locked up on Kip, Jabba was finally the unquestioned leader of the Desiligic clan. He had stepped out of his father's shadow. He had stepped out of his aunt's supervision. He was, for the first time in his 600-year life, operating with no Hutt above him at all. To save Besadii from total collapse after the Ylesia disaster, Durga formally joined Black Sun as one of Xizor's lieutenants, taking the rank of Vigo. That move gave him access to resources no Hutt had ever had before, but it came at a real cost. Every other Hutt clan viewed Durga's Black Sun membership as a betrayal of Hutt independence itself, and Besadii found itself increasingly isolated inside the council. The Desiligic Besadii feud that had reshaped the clan hierarchy was not over. It had just entered a new phase, with Jabba sitting at the top of the Hutt world and Durga operating half inside the traditional Hutt system and half outside of it. And from here, the story turns to the Galactic Empire, and to the moment when all of Jabba's careful work is going to come undone in one afternoon on a sail barge. This is the chapter most Star Wars fans actually know from the movies, but the version you get on screen leaves out a lot of the most interesting parts of what happened to Jabba, his court, and the Besadii clan he had spent his whole life fighting. Once the Galactic Empire took over the galaxy, the Hutts did something that might seem surprising on the surface. They actually did quite well. Emperor Palpatine's regime officially stood against crime and lawlessness, but in practice, the Empire treated the Hutt cartel as a protected business partner in exchange for services the Imperial government genuinely needed. The Hutts controlled so much of the Outer Rim's economy that going after them directly would have collapsed entire sectors overnight. Imperial High Command understood that math very clearly. Any Imperial move against Hutt smuggling operations had to be cleared through the top of the command structure first, which gave the Hutts a kind of untouchable status through paperwork alone. Even when the Empire cracked down on prisoners across the galaxy, the Hutts and a few select corporations were given explicit exemptions. Jabba's influence did not fade under the Empire. It grew, because the Empire was quietly wiping out his criminal competitors for him while letting him keep operating. By 1 BBY, a Corellian smuggler you already know had climbed his way up to becoming Jabba's top pilot. Han Solo was running Kessel Spice on the Millennium Falcon with Chewbacca by his side, and business was good. Then Solo had the kind of bad day that reshapes a person's entire life. An Imperial patrol ship boarded his vessel mid-run, and Solo had to dump his full shipment of Kessel Spice into space to keep from getting caught. The spice was gone. The Imperial threat was avoided, and Jabba's investment, which Solo had personally signed off on, was now scattered across the void. Jabba was furious. He demanded full compensation for the lost shipment. Han could not pay. Every credit Solo had made on that run, and dozens before, it was already spent. Because that is how Han Solo always was. So Jabba did what any Hutt crime lord would do. He put a massive bounty on Han's head and sent it out to every bounty hunter in the galaxy. The Rhodian bounty hunter Greedo, who had actually been on Jabba's payroll at various points, tried to collect the bounty inside the Mos Eisley Cantina. Han Solo handled the situation first, which bought him a little more time but added another 15% onto the debt he already owed Jabba. Solo then took off from Tatooine with Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke Skywalker, and the 2 droids, joining the Rebel Alliance. Jabba never forgot. Jabba also never let a debt go. Back on Tatooine, Jabba's palace had become the single most notorious gangster court in the galaxy. Bounty hunters passing through the Outer Rim stopped there to take jobs. Musicians and dancers performed there for audiences of smugglers and owners. Assassins of every species rotated through looking for work. The palace was a crossroads for every kind of person the Empire officially considered criminal, and Jabba sat at the center of it as the undisputed host. His inner circle alone tells you what the operation looked like. Bib Fortuna, a Twi'lek, served as his major domo, running daily palace business. Kossak, a Quarren, handled the accounting and was also secretly skimming money off the top for himself. A Hutt named Woof managed the fleet of skiffs and the sail barge Katana. A Klatooinian named Barada, whose name we have heard many times already in this story, ran the palace mechanics. A Shevan named Efant Mon handled security and was, according to most accounts, the only being in the galaxy Jabba considered an actual friend. Beneath the throne room, Jabba kept a rancor named Patissa in a covered pit. Patissa was cared for by a human prisoner named Malakili, who genuinely loved the creature. Jabba used the rancor as his preferred method of getting rid of people who displeased him, which was a lot of people. The throne room was also where he kept his imprisoned dancers. The Twi'lek Ula performed there before being dropped into the pit when she refused to come to him. Later on, Princess Leia Organa would end up chained at the same throne in the same gold bikini costume. A musician named Jess served at the court to pay off her father's debts. And that Askajian dancer we talked about earlier, Yarna Dal Gargan, was still being forced to wear the makeup that made her resemble Jabba's long-past mother, which is a detail that was deeply strange even by Jabba's standards. Jabba's chance to actually get Han Solo back came in 3 ABY. During the events on Cloud City, Darth Vader captured Solo and had him frozen in carbonite, mostly as a test of whether the technology could safely be used on Luke Skywalker later. Vader handed the carbonite slab to Boba Fett as a gift, and Fett flew the slab straight to Tatooine to collect Jabba's full bounty. Jabba paid Fett, took the slab, and hung Han Solo on his throne room wall as a decoration. By most accounts, he called Solo his favorite decoration. That was the status of one of the galaxy's most famous smugglers for the better part of a year. He was wall art in a Hutt palace. The whole Hutt underworld celebrated the capture. The message was simple and powerful. Nobody got away from Jabba forever, not even his best smuggler. But putting Han Solo on display like that also drew the attention of the rebellion, and Solo's friends were not willing to leave him there. In 4 ABY, they came for him. The rescue was put together by Luke Skywalker, who was now a fully trained Jedi Knight. Luke sent the 2 droids ahead with a message offering them as gifts. Jabba kept the droids but refused the bargain, putting the Golden Protocol droid to work as a translator in the throne room and assigning the astromech to serve drinks on the sail barge Katana. Princess Leia then infiltrated the palace disguised as an obese bounty hunter named Boushh, and she brought Chewbacca with her supposedly to collect the bounty on his head. At night, she freed Solo from his carbonite prison. What she did not know was that Jabba had been watching the whole thing from the beginning. She was captured the moment Solo was revived, and she was the one chained up in the gold bikini at Jabba's throne. Lando Calrissian, meanwhile, had already been inside the palace for weeks, disguised as a palace guard using the name Tamtel Screege. The final piece of the rescue was already in place before Luke even walked in. And then Luke walked in. He delivered one final warning to Jabba, offering him a chance to let the prisoners go peacefully Jabba laughed and dropped him through the trapdoor into the Rancor pit. What Jabba did not expect was that Luke would take down Patissa. The shock of watching his favorite pet fall to a Jedi stunned everyone in the palace, Jabba included, and it infuriated the Hutt more than almost anything ever had. He immediately ordered Luke, Han, and Chewbacca transported to a place called the Great Pit of Carkoon, where a creature called the Sarlacc would slowly digest them over the next 1,000 years. Jabba personally boarded the sail barge Kitana to witness the execution, bringing his entire court with him. Once they all reached the pit, Luke signaled the astromech droid from the skiff, and the droid launched the lightsaber Luke had hidden on him. In the chaos that followed, Luke, Lando, Chewbacca, and Han fought off Jabba's guards on the skiffs outside the barge. Inside the barge itself, something else was happening. Princess Leia Organa, still chained to Jabba's throne, reached down and grabbed the same chain that was holding her. She wrapped it around Jabba's neck and ended him with it. Jabba's long life came to an end in 4 ABY, wrapped in the chain of a prisoner he had been trying to own on a sail barge out in the deserts of Tatooine. The moment became so famous across the galactic underworld that for decades afterward, Niktos, like the gang leader Rinri Vindi, would refer to Leia Organa with genuine reverence as Hutt Slayer. She had taken down the most powerful crime lord in the galaxy with the exact tool he had used to dehumanize her. The rebels escaped on the skiffs, destroyed the Kitana as they left, and took out most of Jabba's court, along with their master. Jabba's criminal empire collapsed instantly. Every debtor who had been held in what was called permanent hock to the Desiligic clan was suddenly freed. Every member of Jabba's organization who had been held in check by his personal authority turned on each other as they all tried to grab whatever piece of the operation they could. His majordomo Bib Fortuna managed to seize the palace itself briefly and declared himself daimyo of Tatooine. But he was eventually eliminated and replaced by Boba Fett. The Hutts back on Nal Hutta could not agree on who should actually inherit Jabba's ventures, and his imprisoned population, including the Niktos, was freed in the chaos of the collapse. Around the same time, Jabba's father, Zorba, was released from his long prison sentence on Kip, pulled out by agents of Isan Izard, the director of Imperial Intelligence. Zorba took his ship, called the Zorba Express, and traveled to Tatooine looking for whoever had ended his son. The Hutt clan itself sent agents to investigate the wreckage of the Kitana to figure out exactly what had happened. What they found was a hollow recording of Leia choking Jabba with her own chain. Copies of that recording started circulating, and the clan then spent enormous resources hunting down every copy they could find, because the footage showed something the Hutts could not afford the galaxy to see. A single chained prisoner had taken down the most powerful Hutt in history, which meant Hutts could be beaten. That was not a message the cartel wanted floating around. While all of that was going on, the other major Hutt in this story was making his own move. Durga Besadi Tai, who we watched take down Giliak at the end of Section 13, saw something in the aftermath of Endor that almost no other Hutt noticed at first. Within about 6 months of each other, both Jabba and Prince Shizor of Black Sun were suddenly gone. 2 of the most powerful criminal figures in the galaxy were removed from the game in the same window, and Durga moved immediately to fill at least one of the gaps. He used the chaos to seize control of the reorganized Black Sun Syndicate and install himself at its top. Within 8 years of the Battle of Endor, Durga had pushed the Besadai clan into the dominant position on Nal Hut-A over every other Hut clan. Durga had one specific ambition that was bigger than anything Besadii had ever attempted before. He wanted to build his own super weapon. The project was called the Dark Saber, and it was a battle station designed around the same kind of primary super laser the original Death Star had used. Durga captured Bevel Lemelisk, who was the actual engineer behind both of the original Death Stars, and forced him to design the weapon. What Durga would not do was spend the kind of money this project actually required. He refused to pay for proper materials or quality construction. The Dark Saber was built on the cheap by Tauril laborers using inferior parts, which made the whole station structurally fragile from the first day it existed. The New Republic noticed. A commando team led by General Krix Madine and a second officer named General Grid Marine, whom Durga personally eliminated, tried to sabotage the project from the inside. The mission failed. When a full New Republic fleet eventually arrived to destroy the Darksaber, Durga made one final bad decision. He tried to use the station's own super laser to blast an escape corridor through the asteroid field surrounding the weapon. The super laser misfired. 2 massive asteroid chunks, probably pulled in by the misfire itself, slammed into the Darksaber and broke the whole station apart. Durga went with it, ending the Besadi clan's last bid for real galactic power in the most literal way possible. Jabba was gone. Durga was gone. The 2 Hutt clan leaders, whose rivalry had defined the entire late era of Hutt politics, were both out of the picture within a decade of each other. And the Hutts back on Nal Hut-A were about to face an invasion from outside the galaxy itself, the likes of which they had never been forced to deal with before. The Hutts had survived plenty of invasions in their history, but what came for them in 25 ABY was something different, something from outside the galaxy entirely. After Durga's Darksaber broke apart in that asteroid field, his cousin Borga Besadi Diori stepped in to take over Clan Besadi. Borga lost control of Black Sun in the transition, but she kept the clan's prominence on Nal Hutta steady. The New Republic, which had replaced the Empire, started introducing financial regulations and patrolling galactic shipping lanes more aggressively, which did cut into Hutt influence but never actually ended it. Newer criminal operations, including one run by a figure named Rinriven D, started rushing in to fill the gaps the aging Hutt power base was leaving open. And both major New Republic political factions, the Populists and the Centrists, openly disliked the Hutts, which meant any hope of political rehabilitation was basically off the table. Then, in 25 ABY, the Yuuzhan Vong arrived. The Yuuzhan Vong came from a completely separate galaxy, and they were not part of any Star Wars conflict that had come before. Their executor, a figure named Nom Anor, told his forces that the Hutts would roll over for them without a fight. Nom Anor believed the Hutts had no interest in resisting. Borga, playing the only hand she had, negotiated a truce with the invaders on behalf of the cartel. The terms were classic Hutt. The Hutts would cooperate with the Yuuzhan Vong in exchange for protection of Hutt territory. But Borga was also secretly spying on the Vong and feeding information back to the New Republic. She was playing both sides. The Vong knew. They started feeding the Hutts misinformation on purpose, telling them that Corellia and Bothawui were the next big targets when the actual target was Fondor. And at one diplomatic meeting, Borga managed to goad the Yuuzhan Vong commander, Nas Choka, into revealing the location of a crucial war coordinator called a Yamosk. Choka did not forget that. After the Vong lost 2/3 of their fleet at the Battle of Vontor in 26 ABY, taken apart by the combined New Republic and Hape's consortium forces with help from Centerpoint Station, Choka moved his remaining forces directly to Nal Hutta to collect on Borga's double-dealing. The Battle of Nal Hutta was brutal. Choka blockaded both Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa. Borga could only defend the capital with about half the Hutt clans behind her, which was nowhere near enough. The Vong bombarded both worlds with biological weapons. One strain of bacteria actually broke down the duracrete of Nar Shaddaa into sand, literally digesting the vertical city from the inside. Another strain attacked metal and transparasteel and collapsed the moon's famous high towers. A third strain was engineered specifically to break through Hutt immune systems, which were normally extremely tough. And then came one of the strangest moments in the whole war. When the Yuuzhan Vong finally pushed down to the surface of Nal Hutta, they ran into something they had not expected. Ancient war robots from the empire of Zim the Despot, preserved by the Hutts as a last line of defense for roughly 25,000 years. Think about that for a second. The same machines the Hutts had captured after defeating Zim at Vontor were still functional, still sitting in Hutt storage, and now they were activating against an extragalactic invasion force. The droids were eventually taken apart, but they took thousands of Vong warriors with them on the way down. Clan Besadii was specifically targeted during the fighting. The Vong refused to let Besadii surrender at all, and the survivors had to flee to Gamorr, Tatooine, and Rhodia to escape. The Hutts were pushed off Nal Hutta and off Nar Shaddaa, and the Vong began Vong-forming both worlds, using their organic technology to reshape the environment into something that suited their own biology. Ironically, that process turned both worlds back into the lush jungles they had been before the Hutts ever arrived, just twisted into Yuuzhan Vong biology instead of Evochii biology. A Hutt underground resistance formed almost immediately, made up of Hutts who refused to leave their home. Meanwhile, the worlds deep inside Hutt territory in the Butana Hutta, including a world called Mulatan, managed to resist the Vong forming. Galactic Alliance scientists suspected the Hutts had some kind of secret biotechnology blocking the Vong's organic reshaping, but the Hutts never confirmed it. By 29 ABY, the Vong were defeated, and they abandoned the worlds they had Vong formed. The Hutts gradually reclaimed Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa over the following decades. Mulatan became the third official capital of the sector during the Reconstruction period. By 41 ABY, Hutt space had mostly recovered, joined the Confederation during the Second Galactic Civil War, and locked in its position in the regional oversector again. Then, in 44 ABY, the final domino fell. The lost tribe of Sith, an ancient Sith offshoot that had been stranded for thousands of years on a planet called Kesh, desecrated the Fountain of Ancients on Tatooine. That was the sacred site the Hutts had contractually promised to protect when Baradam Beg signed the Treaty of Vontor 25,144 years earlier. The Hutts failed to defend it. That failure gave the Tatooinians the legal ground they needed to declare the entire Treaty of Vontor null and void. The Tatooinian prisoner revolt spread fast, pulling in sympathy uprisings across the galaxy. A Galactic Alliance team, led by Leia Organa Solo, the same Hutt Slayer from the sail barge, helped the rebels organize and negotiate Tatooine's admission into the Alliance. The Nikto and Vodran followed. The treaty that had bound 3 warrior species to Hutt service since the age of Kossak was finally finished. That ended the oldest arrangement in Hutt history. The prisoner species foundation the entire cartel had been built on for 25,000 years was gone, freed in a single diplomatic stroke. A few decades later, during the rise of Darth Krayt's One Sith Empire, around 130 ABY, the Hutts did exactly what the Hutts had always done. They aligned with whoever held the center of the galaxy. Krayt tolerated them because their economic utility was still worth more than any Sith moral concern. And through every ruler, every war, every regime, the Hutts kept operating.